The small hospital on the outskirts of town was quiet, save for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional beep of a monitor. Clara Johnson, the night shift nurse, leaned against the counter at the nurse's station, sipping her lukewarm coffee. It was nearing midnight, and most of her patients were either sleeping or stable, a rare reprieve in her hectic routine. Follow the whole story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your opinion below in the comments section. It motivates us to share more impactful stories. She glanced at the clock. Another 6 hours to go. Just as she turned to check on her charts, the automatic doors of the ER slid open with a soft whoosh. Clara frowned. They rarely had visitors this late, especially ones who walked in without an ambulance. A man stepped inside, his tall frame slightly hunched as if he were trying to make himself smaller. He wore a gray hoodie with the hood pulled up, casting shadows over his face. His jeans were dusty, and his sneakers looked worn, but it wasn't his attire that caught Clara's attention. It was the way he moved, hesitant, almost reluctant. "Can I help you?" Clara called, stepping out from behind the counter. The man hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm not feeling great." Clara's practiced eyes scanned him quickly. He wasn't bleeding, and he didn't appear to be in immediate distress, but there was something off about him. He looked tired, not just physically, but deeply, bone-achingly exhausted. "Have a seat," she said, gesturing to a nearby chair. "I'll grab some paperwork." The man obeyed, sinking into the chair as if it were holding him up. Clara returned moments later with a clipboard and a pen. "Name?" she asked, flipping to the first page. "Elon," he said, his voice quiet. "Elon?" she prompted, waiting for a last name. He hesitated, then muttered, "Musk." Clara blinked, certain she'd misheard. She glanced up, her pen hovering over the paper. "Sorry, could you repeat that?" "Elon Musk," he said, his tone firmer this time. Clara stared at him, the name ringing bells in her mind. Surely it was a coincidence. The man sitting in front of her, dressed like he just rolled out of a long road trip, couldn't be that Elon Musk, could he? Deciding not to press the issue, for now, she continued. "All right, Mr. Musk, can you tell me what's going on? What symptoms are you experiencing?" Elon rubbed his temples, his fingers trembling slightly. "Headache. Fatigue. Haven't been sleeping much." Clara nodded, jotting down notes. "Any underlying medical conditions? Allergies? Medications?" "No," he said shortly, shifting in his seat. "Okay. And when was the last time you ate?" He frowned, as if trying to remember. Yesterday morning, I think." Clara's brows knitted together. "That's not great. Are you hydrated? Have you been drinking water?" "Some," he admitted, though his tone made it clear he hadn't been drinking nearly enough. She finished her notes and stood. "All right, let's get you into an exam room. Dr. Patel is on call tonight. He'll check you out. In the meantime, I'll grab you some water and a snack." Elon nodded, pushing himself to his feet. As he followed her down the hall, Clara couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she'd seen his face before, though she still couldn't place where. She led him to room 3, flipping on the light and motioning for him to sit on the exam table. "Make yourself comfortable. The doctor will be here in a few minutes." "Thanks," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Clara left the room and headed to the small kitchenette near the nurse's station. She grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of crackers, her mind still turning over the strange interaction. Could he really be that Elon Musk? It seemed impossible, but the resemblance was uncanny. And what would someone like him be doing in their tiny hospital in the middle of nowhere? Shaking her head, she returned to room 3 and handed him the water and crackers. "Here, eat slowly, okay?" "Thanks," he said again, opening the water bottle and taking a cautious sip. Clara lingered for a moment, watching him. He seemed fragile in a way that didn't align with the larger-than-life image she associated with the name Elon Musk. If he really was who he claimed to be, then something must have driven him to this point. "Is there anyone you'd like us to call?" she asked gently. "Family? Friends?" Elon shook his head, avoiding her gaze. "No, I'm fine." It was a lie, but Clara didn't push. Instead, she offered a reassuring smile. "Okay, just rest here for now. Dr. Patel will be in shortly. As she left the room, her mind raced. She couldn't resist the urge to Google his name. Pulling out her phone, she typed it into the search bar. The first image that popped up confirmed her suspicion. The man in room 3 was indeed the Elon Musk. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Why was he here, alone and seemingly on the verge of collapse? And why did he seem so determined to avoid drawing attention to himself? As Clara put her phone away, a sense of unease settled over her. Whatever had brought Elon Musk to their small hospital, it wasn't something he was ready to talk about. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning of something far bigger than she could imagine. The air in the small hospital grew heavier as the night wore on. Clara couldn't shake the realization that the man resting in room 3 was indeed the Elon Musk, one of the most recognizable faces in the world. Yet, here he was, sitting quietly in a nondescript hospital bed, drinking water and eating crackers like any other patient. Clara paced the hallway outside his room, replaying their brief interaction. Something about his demeanor gnawed at her. He wasn't just tired. He looked haunted. Whatever had driven him to this remote hospital in the middle of the night, it was more than physical exhaustion. The soft creak of the exam room door opening interrupted her thoughts. Elon stepped out, his posture slightly more upright than before. He looked at her, his face partially obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. "Can I just leave?" he asked hesitantly. Clara blinked, surprised. "You haven't even seen the doctor yet. You're clearly unwell, Mr. Musk." He flinched at the mention of his name, glancing around the hallway as if expecting paparazzi to burst through the doors. "Please, just call me Elon." She nodded, softening her tone. "Elon, I understand you might not want to be here, but you need medical attention. Dr. Patel is thorough and discreet. No one will know you're here." He hesitated, then sighed, rubbing his temples again. "Fine." Clara gently guided him back into the room and closed the door. Moments later, Dr. Patel entered, his face lined with the weariness of countless night shifts. "Good evening, Mr. Musk," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Dr. Patel. I understand you're not feeling well." Elon shook his hand briefly, nodding. "Yeah, just tired. Headaches. Haven't been eating or sleeping much." Dr. Patel nodded, pulling a small flashlight from his coat pocket. "Let's take a look. Any chest pain, dizziness, or trouble breathing?" "No," Elon replied, though his tone was clipped. The doctor proceeded with a basic examination, checking Elon's pulse, blood pressure, and reflexes. As he worked, Clara stood nearby, observing silently. She noticed how Elon flinched slightly at the doctor's touch and avoided prolonged eye contact. It was clear that whatever he was dealing with, it wasn't just physical. "Your vitals are stable," Dr. Patel concluded, jotting notes on his clipboard, "but you're severely dehydrated and showing signs of exhaustion. When was the last time you had a proper meal or a full night's sleep?" Elon shrugged. "I don't know. A week? Maybe more." Dr. Patel frowned. "That's not sustainable, Mr. Musk. Your body needs rest and proper nutrition. I'd recommend in 4 drip to rehydrate you and, frankly, at least a few days of downtime." Elon shook his head firmly. "I don't have time for that." "Then make time," Dr. Patel said, his tone firm. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse." Clara stepped forward, her voice soft but insistent. "He's right, Elon. Whatever's going on, you can't keep pushing yourself like this. Let us help." Elon looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Clara thought he might argue, but then he sighed deeply, the fight seeming to drain out of him. "Fine. Do what you need to do." Dr. Patel nodded and stepped out to arrange the 4. Clara moved to prepare the supplies, but as she passed Elon, he spoke again, his voice so low she almost didn't hear him. "Do you ever feel like, no matter what you do, it's never enough?" She stopped, turning to face him. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I have all these ideas, these plans to change the world. And for every step forward, it feels like there's 1,000 obstacles pushing me back. Sometimes I wonder if it's even worth it." Clara hesitated, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to patients opening up to her like this, let alone someone like Elon Musk. But she could hear the pain in his voice, and it struck a chord deep within her. "I think we all feel that way sometimes," she said carefully, "like we're fighting an uphill battle. But that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting." He looked up at her then, his blue eyes piercing despite the shadows under them. "And what if the fight costs you everything?" Clara opened her mouth to reply, but the door swung open, and Dr. Patel returned with the 4 equipment. The moment was broken, and Elon turned away, retreating back into himself. The 4 drip took only minutes to set up, but Clara stayed in the room, monitoring Elon as the fluids began to flow. He leaned back against the pillows, his eyes closed, his breathing steadying. For the first time since he'd arrived, he looked almost peaceful. "You should try to sleep," Clara said softly. "Even a short nap will help." He didn't respond, but his breathing slowed further, and she realized he'd already drifted off. Clara pulled a blanket over him and dimmed the lights, her heart heavy with unspoken questions. As Clara closed the door behind her, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of pressure could bring a man like Elon Musk to his breaking point, and whether she'd ever truly understand the weight he carried. The hospital corridors were unusually quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of paper at the nurse's station. Clara sat at her desk, her thoughts circling back to Elon Musk. He'd fallen asleep earlier, but his restless movements on the monitor suggested a mind unable to let go. She found herself wondering what had brought him here, to this unassuming hospital in the middle of nowhere. There was no press, no entourage, no assistants hovering nearby to manage his every whim. Just a man who seemed entirely alone. The soft chime of her pager pulled her back to reality. It was room 3. Clara grabbed her clipboard and headed down the hall. Inside the room, Elon was sitting up, his hand rubbing his temple as if trying to ease away an unseen pain. The 4-bag beside him was nearly empty. "Couldn't sleep?" Clara asked, her voice gentle. He shook his head. "I did, for about 10 minutes. Then the dreams started." She didn't press him to elaborate, sensing it was a topic he wasn't ready to explore. Instead, she checked his 4 vitals, noting that his pulse was steadier than when he'd arrived. "You're improving," she said with a small smile. "The fluids are working." Elon gave a faint nod but said nothing. Clara hesitated, then decided to take a chance. "Sometimes talking helps," she offered. "You don't have to say much, but keeping it all inside can be worse than whatever's haunting you." For a moment, she thought he'd brush her off, but then he surprised her. "I came here because I couldn't go anywhere else," he said quietly. "Not without the world knowing. Not without cameras and questions and 100 people demanding answers I don't have." Clara pulled up a chair and sat across from him. "Why this hospital?" Elon met her gaze, his expression conflicted. "I didn't plan to come here specifically. I was driving, just driving, and I saw the sign. I figured a small place like this would be quiet, safe." Clara nodded, understanding. "Well, you were right about that. We don't get many high-profile visitors. Mostly locals or travelers passing through." He let out a hollow laugh. "Lucky me." There was a pause, the room heavy with unspoken tension. Then Elon looked at her again, his eyes darker than before. "Do you ever feel like you're drowning?" he asked. "Like no matter how hard you fight, the water just keeps rising?" Clara took a deep breath. "Sometimes. But I've learned that asking for help isn't a weakness. It's how you keep yourself from going under." Elon looked away, his jaw tightening. Asking for help doesn't work when everyone expects you to be the one with all the answers. His words hit her like a blow. She'd always thought of Elon Musk as larger than life. A visionary, a genius, someone who seemed untouchable. But here he was, stripped of the public persona, just a man struggling under the weight of impossible expectations. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway. Clara turned to see Dr. Patel entering the room, his expression grim. "Clara," he said, glancing between her and Elon, "there's a situation in the ER. We need all hands." Clara stood immediately. "What's going on?" "Car accident on the highway. Multiple injuries. We're short-staffed tonight." "I'll be right there," she said, turning back to Elon. "Stay here and rest. I'll check on you as soon as I can." Elon nodded, though the tension in his shoulders suggested he was far from relaxed. As Clara left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that their conversation was far from over. The ER was chaos. Gurneys lined the walls, and the air was filled with the sounds of groaning patients and hurried orders. Clara dove into the fray, assisting wherever she was needed. She bandaged wounds, stabilized patients, and reassured frightened family members. Hours passed in a blur, and by the time the rush subsided, she was exhausted. She returned to the nurse's station, hoping for a brief moment of peace, when a shadow fell across her desk. It was Elon. He was still in his hospital gown, his hood pulled up over his head. "You shouldn't be out of bed," Clara said, standing quickly. "You need rest." He shook his head. "I couldn't just sit there. I heard the commotion and I thought maybe I could help." She frowned. "Help how?" He hesitated, then said, "I don't know. Maybe with logistics? Organizing resources? I'm good at that." Clara studied him, noting the genuine concern in his expression. "That's kind of you, but we've got it under control." "Are you sure?" he pressed. "I'm used to working under pressure." "I could." "Elon," she interrupted gently, "you're a patient right now. Let us take care of you." He seemed ready to argue but then sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fine, but if there's anything I can do, let me know." She nodded, touched by his offer despite the exhaustion etched into his features. "I will." Later, as the sun began to rise, Clara made her way back to Elon's room. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the pale light of dawn. "You should try to sleep," she said softly, stepping inside. He glanced at her, his eyes weary but alert. "So should you." Clara chuckled. "Touché." There was a brief silence before he spoke again. "I meant what I said earlier. About helping. I don't like feeling useless." "You're not useless," Clara said firmly. "And the fact that you even want to help says a lot about who you are." He didn't reply, but the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. As Clara left the room, she couldn't help but wonder, what kind of man was Elon Musk beneath the headlines and the fame? And why did she feel so compelled to find out? The early morning light filtered through the blinds in room 3, casting soft patterns on the walls. Clara stood by the nurse's station, reviewing the night's charts. Despite the hectic rush of the ER hours before, her thoughts kept drifting back to Elon Musk. There was something raw, something deeply human about the man she'd met last night. She pushed the thoughts aside and focused on the work at hand. But as she turned to file the papers, she saw him again, standing in the hallway. His hospital gown had been swapped for a casual hoodie and jeans someone must have brought him. "You're out of bed again," Clara said, a teasing edge to her voice as she approached him. "I figured I'd overstayed my welcome in there," Elon replied, nodding toward his room. "And I wanted to stretch my legs." Clara sighed, her expression softening. "Fair enough. But you're not supposed to be wandering around unsupervised." "Consider me supervised," he said with a faint grin. As they walked, Elon asked about the hospital. "How long have you worked here?" he inquired, glancing around at the aging walls and flickering lights. 5 years, Clara said. "It's not the most glamorous place, but it's home. We do a lot with very little." He frowned. "That's not right. Places like this are essential. They should have all the resources they need." Clara laughed, the sound tinged with irony. "If you figure out how to fix that, let me know." The comment hung in the air, and for a moment, Elon seemed lost in thought. Clara led him to the small cafeteria, where a few nurses were grabbing quick breakfast between shifts. "You should eat," she suggested, gesturing to the sparse buffet of cereal and toast. Elon raised an eyebrow at the modest spread but said nothing. He grabbed a tray and served himself, following Clara to a corner table. As they sat, Clara found herself curious. "You mentioned last night that you came here to escape. What were you running from?" He hesitated, the spoon in his hand pausing midair. Then he sighed. "Everything. The pressure, the scrutiny. Every decision I make feels like it's under a microscope. One wrong move, and it's front-page news." She nodded, letting him speak. "I've always believed in pushing boundaries, taking risks. But lately, it's like no matter what I do, it's not enough. People expect miracles, and when I can't deliver, they're quick to tear me down. Clara studied him, her own heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. That sounds unbearable. It is, he admitted, but it's also my own doing. I built this life. I just didn't realize how heavy it would get. She reached across the table, placing a hand over his. Everyone has limits, Elon. Even you. Their conversation was interrupted by a nurse approaching their table. Clara, Dr. Patel needs you in room 7. One of the ER patients from last night is having complications. I'll be right there, Clara said, standing. She turned to Elon, her expression apologetic. Stay here and finish your breakfast. I'll check on you later. He nodded, though his gaze lingered on her as she walked away. The rest of Clara's morning was a whirlwind. The patient in room 7 required intensive care, and several other emergencies kept her on her feet. By the time she returned to the cafeteria, Elon was gone. She felt a pang of worry but quickly found him in the waiting area, sitting with a small group of children who had come in for routine checkups. He was showing them a diagram on his phone, explaining something with animated gestures. Clara couldn't help but smile. Making friends? Elon looked up, a sheepish expression crossing his face. They were curious about rockets. I couldn't resist. One of the children, a boy no older than 6, tugged on Clara's sleeve. He said he makes spaceships. Clara crouched down, smiling at the boy. He does. Pretty amazing, isn't it? The boy nodded enthusiastically before running back to his mother. As the day wore on, Clara noticed a change in Elon. He seemed more relaxed, more present. The weight he'd carried when he arrived hadn't disappeared, but it was no longer crushing him. In the afternoon, as she finished her rounds, she found him in the garden behind the hospital. It was a small, unkempt space with a few benches and overgrown shrubs, but the sunlight made it feel peaceful. Thought you'd be resting, she said, approaching him. He shrugged. Resting doesn't come easily to me. Clara sat beside him, the quiet of the garden a welcome reprieve. How are you feeling? Better, he admitted. Talking to you, it's helped. I'm glad, she said, her voice soft. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the hospital fading into the background. Finally, Elon spoke. You said earlier that this hospital does a lot with very little. What did you mean by that? Clara gestured around them. Look at this place. The equipment is outdated. We're understaffed. And yet, we keep going because people here depend on us. Elon nodded, his gaze thoughtful. That's admirable. But it shouldn't be this way. No, Clara agreed. It shouldn't. As Clara returned to her duties, Elon remained in the garden, his mind racing with ideas. For the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of purpose. One that had nothing to do with the expectations of the world and everything to do with the nurse who had reminded him of what truly mattered. The next morning, Clara walked into the hospital with her usual to-go cup of coffee, bracing for another busy day. As she approached the nurse's station, she noticed a small commotion near the waiting area. Curious, she weaved through the throng of staff and patients and stopped in her tracks. Elon Musk stood there, clipboard in hand, talking animatedly to a group of hospital administrators. His casual attire had been swapped for a sharp blazer, though his signature understated sneakers remained. Clara, he called out as he spotted her. A wide smile spread across his face. Just the person I was hoping to see. She approached cautiously, eyebrows raised. Good morning, Elon. What's going on? He gestured at the administrators. We're discussing improvements. The head administrator, Mrs. Franklin, a reserved but kind woman nearing retirement, gave Clara a bewildered look. Mr. Musk has some interesting ideas for the hospital. Clara shot Elon a questioning glance. Care to elaborate? Elon handed her the clipboard. On it was a list of proposed upgrades, new medical equipment, an expanded pediatric wing, a refurbished emergency room, and additional staff funding. I stayed up all night thinking about what you said yesterday, Elon began, his voice full of conviction, about how much this place does with so little. It's not right, Clara. A hospital should be a place of healing, not a battle for resources. Clara scanned the list, her pulse quickening. The proposals were bold, ambitious, and expensive. This is incredible, but how do you plan to make it happen? By funding it myself, Elon said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. A stunned silence fell over the group. Clara's mouth opened, but no words came out. Mrs. Franklin cleared her throat, her professional demeanor slipping. Mr. Musk, we appreciate your generosity, but projects like these take months, sometimes years, to plan and approve. Then we start now, Elon replied, undeterred. Tell me what you need most, and we'll prioritize that. Clara pulled him aside, out of earshot of the others. Elon, this is beyond generous. But why are you doing this? He looked at her, his blue eyes earnest. Because I can. And because people like you shouldn't have to fight to do your jobs. Her breath caught. This isn't just about me. No, he agreed. It's about everyone who walks through these doors. But you reminded me why I started all of this. Why I became an entrepreneur. It wasn't about money or fame. It was about solving problems, making life better. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. Thank you, she said softly. Elon smiled, but his expression quickly turned serious. There's one thing, though. What's that? I need your help, he said. If we're going to make this work, I need someone on the inside. Someone who knows this hospital, the people, the challenges. Her eyes widened. You want me to, what? Be your consultant? Exactly, he said. You're passionate, smart, and you care. That's exactly what this project needs. Clara's mind raced. The offer was tempting, but the implications were overwhelming. Her work as a nurse already consumed most of her time. Could she juggle this new responsibility on top of everything else? Before she could respond, an urgent voice crackled over the hospital intercom. Code Blue, Room 5. Her instincts kicked in. We'll talk later, she said, rushing toward the emergency. Elon watched her go, admiration flickering across his face. The chaos in Room 5 was a stark reminder of why Clara loved, and sometimes hated, her job. A middle-aged man had gone into cardiac arrest, and the team was working frantically to stabilize him. Clara joined without hesitation, her hands moving swiftly and expertly. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually, they revived the patient. The tension in the room dissipated, replaced by collective relief. As Clara stepped out into the hallway, she found Elon waiting for her. That was incredible, he said, his voice tinged with awe. It's just part of the job, she replied, though her exhaustion was evident. Just part of the job, he repeated, shaking his head. You save lives, Clara. That's not something to downplay. She gave him a tired smile. It's what I'm trained to do. Later that evening, Clara found herself in the garden again. The crisp air was a welcome reprieve after the chaotic day. She sat on a bench, staring at the fading sunset, when Elon appeared. You've been busy, he said, sitting beside her. So have you, she countered. I still don't know how to answer your offer. Take your time, he said, but I meant what I said earlier. I can't do this without you. She studied him, searching for any sign that he might be doing this out of guilt or for publicity. But all she saw was sincerity. I'll think about it, she said finally. Good, he replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. Because I've already started making calls. Clara chuckled, shaking her head. You don't waste any time, do you? Not when something matters, he said, his tone serious. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Clara realized that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. What she didn't know was that Elon's plans were already in motion, and they would transform not just the hospital, but the entire community. Clara woke up the next morning feeling a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. Elon Musk's grand plans for the hospital replayed in her mind like a vivid dream. As she got ready for her shift, she couldn't shake the feeling that the day would bring more surprises. Walking into the hospital, Clara was greeted by her colleague and best friend, Nurse Linda. Linda's sharp eyes immediately noticed Clara's distracted expression. All right, spill it, Linda demanded, crossing her arms. What's going on with you? You look like you've been plotting world domination. Clara hesitated, then decided to tell Linda everything. By the time she finished recounting Elon's proposals, Linda's jaw had practically hit the floor. You mean to tell me the Elon Musk is turning this hospital into his pet project? Linda exclaimed, earning curious glances from passing staff. And he wants you to help? Keep it down, Clara hissed, pulling Linda into a quiet corner. And yes, that's the gist of it. Linda leaned against the wall, her expression shifting from shock to awe. Clara, do you have any idea how huge this is? This could change everything. For the hospital, for us. I know, Clara admitted, but it's also terrifying. What if it doesn't work? What if I mess up? Linda placed a reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder. You won't. You've got the biggest heart and the sharpest mind in this place. If anyone can pull this off, it's you. Later that morning, Clara was summoned to Mrs. Franklin's office. She entered to find Elon seated comfortably in a chair, sipping coffee as if he owned the place, which, she realized, he almost did now. Good morning, Clara, Mrs. Franklin greeted, gesturing for her to sit. Mr. Musk has requested that we form a planning committee for his proposed upgrades, and he insists that you be part of it. Clara sat down, her nerves prickling. I'm honored, but I'm still not sure I'm the right person for this. Nonsense, Elon interjected. You're exactly who we need. Someone who understands this place inside and out. Mrs. Franklin nodded. I agree. Clara, your perspective as a nurse will be invaluable. Feeling the weight of their expectations, Clara took a deep breath. All right, I'll do it. Elon grinned. Excellent. Let's get started. The first meeting of the planning committee took place that afternoon in the hospital's conference room. Along with Clara and Elon, the group included Mrs. Franklin, a few department heads, and a representative from the hospital's board of directors. Elon wasted no time diving into the details. Our first priority should be the emergency room. Clara mentioned yesterday that it's often overcrowded and under-equipped. Dr. Patel, the head of emergency medicine, nodded emphatically. That's an understatement. We've had to turn patients away at times because we simply don't have the capacity. Elon scribbled notes in a leather-bound notebook. Then let's fix that. What do you need? Dr. Patel rattled off a list of equipment, additional staff, and structural changes. Elon listened intently, asking questions and jotting down every detail. Clara watched in awe. Despite his larger-than-life persona, Elon was completely focused, treating every suggestion with the utmost seriousness. By the end of the meeting, they had a preliminary plan for the ER upgrades, complete with timelines and budget estimates. This is just the beginning, Elon said as the group dispersed. We'll tackle the other departments next. Over the next few weeks, Clara found herself juggling her nursing duties with her new role on the planning committee. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. She and Elon spent hours discussing everything from staffing needs to architectural designs. Their conversations often extended into the evenings, sometimes over takeout in the hospital cafeteria or on late-night phone calls. Despite their different backgrounds, they developed a mutual respect and camaraderie. One evening, as they reviewed blueprints for the new pediatric wing, Clara couldn't help but ask, "Why do you care so much about this hospital? You could have picked any place in the world." Elon leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Because it's not just about the hospital. It's about the people, the nurses, doctors, patients. You showed me that. Clara felt her cheeks flush. I didn't do much. You did more than you realize, he said. You reminded me what it means to truly make a difference. As the plans for the hospital upgrades progressed, word began to spread. Local news outlets caught wind of Elon's involvement, and soon the hospital was buzzing with reporters and camera crews. Clara tried to keep a low profile, but her role on the committee didn't go unnoticed. One day, a reporter cornered her in the hallway. Miss Thompson, how does it feel to be working with Elon Musk on such a groundbreaking project? Clara blinked, caught off guard. It's an honor. He's been incredibly generous. And do you think these changes will make a real difference for the community? The reporter pressed. Yes, Clara said firmly. They will. That evening, Clara sat in the garden, seeking solace from the chaos of the day. Elon joined her, a cup of coffee in hand. You did great with that reporter, he said, sitting beside her. I wasn't expecting to be ambushed like that, she admitted. But thanks. He chuckled. Get used to it. This project is going to put you in the spotlight. Clara sighed. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. You don't have to be perfect, he said. Just be yourself. That's what got us here in the first place. As the first tangible steps of the hospital's transformation began to take shape, Clara realized that her life was no longer just about routines and responsibilities. She was part of something bigger, something that had the potential to change countless lives. But with the spotlight came new challenges, and Clara wondered if she was truly prepared for what lay ahead. The hum of drills and the clatter of construction tools echoed through the hospital halls. The transformation of the emergency room had officially begun, marking the first step in Elon Musk's ambitious vision. Clara walked past the construction site, feeling a swell of pride and determination. But not everyone shared her enthusiasm. As Clara entered the staff lounge, the air was thick with tension. A group of nurses and doctors huddled in a corner, their voices low but filled with irritation. Can you believe this circus? One of the senior nurses, Janet, grumbled. Elon Musk waltzes in, and suddenly, we're supposed to act like he's our savior. Dr. Reynolds, a gruff, no-nonsense surgeon, nodded in agreement. We've been doing just fine without a billionaire sticking his nose in our business. Clara hesitated by the door, torn between confronting them and slipping away unnoticed. Before she could decide, Linda spotted her. Clara, Linda called, waving her over. The group turned to her with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Good morning, Clara said, trying to keep her tone neutral. Janet crossed her arms. Morning? More like chaos. Do you have any idea how disruptive this construction is? Patients are complaining, and we're short-staffed because half the team is busy accommodating Musk's plans. Clara took a deep breath. I know it's a lot right now, but these upgrades are going to make a huge difference. The ER desperately needs more space and resources. And what about the rest of us? Janet shot back. Is he going to fix everything with a snap of his fingers? Clara met Janet's glare head-on. It's not about snapping fingers. It's about creating long-term solutions. We all know this hospital needs help. Linda stepped in, trying to diffuse the tension. Come on, guys. Let's give it a chance. Change is never easy, but it's not like things were perfect before. The group murmured grudging agreement, but the skepticism lingered. Clara knew it would take more than words to win them over. That afternoon, Clara joined Elon for another planning meeting. This time, they were focused on the new pediatric wing. The architects had prepared preliminary sketches, and the team gathered around the conference table to review them. This design maximizes natural light and includes a dedicated play area for the kids, the lead architect explained, pointing to the blueprints. Clara studied the drawings carefully. What about the parents? A lot of them spend hours, even days, here. Could we include a comfortable waiting area with amenities for them? Elon nodded. Great idea. Let's add that to the plan. As the meeting progressed, Clara noticed Mrs. Franklin frowning at her tablet. Is something wrong? Clara asked. Mrs. Franklin sighed. We've received some pushback from the board. They're concerned about the long-term costs of maintaining these new facilities. Elon leaned forward, his expression sharp. Let me handle the board. This is an investment in the future, not just a one-time expense. Clara admired his confidence, but couldn't help feeling a pang of doubt. What if the board refused to cooperate? What if the resistance from the staff grew stronger? Over the next few days, Clara worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between Elon's vision and the hospital staff's concerns. She organized a town hall meeting, inviting everyone to share their thoughts and ask questions. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as staff members, patients, and community leaders filled the seats. Elon stood at the front, his presence commanding yet approachable. I know change can be daunting, he began, his voice steady. But this isn't just about new buildings or fancy equipment. It's about giving everyone, patients and staff alike, the tools they need to thrive. The audience listened intently as Elon outlined his plans. But when the floor opened for questions, the tension resurfaced. How do we know this won't just benefit the wealthy patients? A young nurse asked. What about the people who can barely afford health care? That's a valid concern, Elon acknowledged. Part of this project includes creating a fund to subsidize care for those who need it most. No one will be left behind. Dr. Reynolds stood up next. What happens when you get bored and move on to your next big project? Who's going to maintain all of this? Elon's jaw tightened, but his tone remained calm. This isn't a vanity project. I'm committed to seeing it through, and I'll make sure the hospital has the resources to sustain these changes. Clara stepped up, feeling a surge of courage. And it's not just about Elon. It's about all of us. We have a chance to create something extraordinary, but it'll take teamwork and trust. The room fell silent. Slowly, a few people began to nod, their skepticism giving way to cautious optimism. As the meeting concluded, Clara caught up with Dr. Reynolds in the hallway. "Thanks for speaking up," she said. "Your questions were important." Dr. Reynolds looked surprised. "I'm just looking out for this place. It's been my home for years." "Mine too," Clara said. "That's why I believe in this project. But we need people like you to keep us grounded." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Thompson. I'll give it a chance. But don't expect me to go easy on Musk." Clara smiled. "Wouldn't dream of it." With the town hall behind her, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. But as progress continued, so did the challenges, and Clara realized that winning over the staff was only the beginning. Bigger obstacles lay ahead, and the success of Elon's vision would depend on whether they could face them together. The sound of drills and construction was almost constant now. The small hospital, which had always been a sanctuary of quiet care, had turned into a bustling hub of transformation. Clara walked down the hallway, her eyes scanning the work in progress. Walls were being knocked down, new rooms were being framed, and electrical lines were being rerouted. It was a whirlwind of activity, and yet, Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Change was happening at a pace she hadn't expected. That afternoon, Clara had a meeting scheduled with Elon, the architects, and the hospital's board members. It was meant to be a pivotal discussion about the next phase of the project. However, the air felt tense as Clara entered the boardroom. Several members of the board were already seated, their expressions grim. Elon was at the head of the table, his eyes scanning over a set of blueprints. He looked up when Clara entered, offering a polite smile. "Clara, great to see you. Have a seat." Clara nodded, but as she sat down, she noticed the discomfort in the room. Mrs. Franklin, the hospital's financial officer, was already shaking her head. "This is getting out of hand, Elon," Mrs. Franklin said, her voice sharp. "The costs are ballooning. You promised efficiency, but I'm seeing estimates for materials, labor, and equipment that we didn't plan for." Elon didn't flinch. "I'm aware of the costs, Mrs. Franklin, but these are investments. We need to think long-term, not just about the next few months." "I'm all for progress," Mrs. Franklin retorted, "but this is a hospital, not a startup. We can't afford to throw money at every shiny new idea." The room grew quiet as Elon leaned forward, his expression firm. "We have no choice but to think outside the box. If we don't modernize, we'll get left behind. We're here to build something sustainable, something that can make a real difference." But Mrs. Franklin wasn't convinced. "And what about the rest of the staff? We've already had complaints from several departments. The construction is disrupting patient care, and there's no clear plan for how we're going to handle the increased patient load once the new wing opens." Clara could feel the pressure building. She'd been working so hard to balance the staff's concerns with Elon's grand vision, but now the cracks were starting to show. The nurses, doctors, and administrators were becoming more vocal, and she wasn't sure how much longer they could hold on to the hope that this project would truly improve the hospital. Elon glanced at Clara, sensing her discomfort. "Clara, why don't you share what we've been working on? I'm sure you've had more direct conversations with the staff than I have." Clara nodded, standing up to address the room. She glanced at the board members, then turned her attention to Mrs. Franklin. "I've spoken to many of the staff members. I know that the construction has been hard on everyone, and there are legitimate concerns. But this hospital has been running on outdated equipment, and the ER is cramped. We need the additional space, the new systems, and the support staff that will come with it. This won't be easy, but it's essential." She paused, looking around the room. "I understand the financial worries, and I know that the staff has been disrupted, but I believe in the long-term vision. This will make us better equipped to serve our community, and we'll be able to help more people than ever before." Mrs. Franklin looked at her skeptically. "But at what cost?" Elon cut in before Clara could respond. "At a cost that's necessary to save this hospital. If we don't modernize now, we'll fall behind. That's a fact. Clara is right. We need to invest in the future." The board members exchanged glances. Clara could tell that the tide was shifting, but slowly. They weren't convinced, not yet. The following day, Clara received an unexpected phone call. It was from one of the nurses who had been particularly vocal about the project's disruptions. "Clara, I don't know if you've heard, but there's been an issue with the ER. The construction crew accidentally cut into one of the water pipes, and now we're dealing with a major leak." Clara's heart sank. "Another problem. What's the situation?" "The ER's flooded. The patients have been moved to other departments, but it's a mess. We can't get a handle on it until the construction team finishes up." Clara cursed under her breath. This was exactly the kind of setback the hospital didn't need. She made her way to the ER, her mind racing with possible solutions. When she arrived, the sight was worse than she'd anticipated. The floor was slick with water, and the air was filled with the scent of damp wood and plaster. "Elon's not going to like this," she muttered to herself as she surveyed the damage. A construction foreman was on the phone, pacing anxiously. "We've got the water turned off, but we need to replace the damaged pipes, and that's going to take a couple of hours." Clara took a deep breath. "Okay, just get it sorted. I'll handle the patients." By the time the issue was resolved, Clara's patience was wearing thin. Every step forward seemed to be met with a new obstacle: disruptions to patient care, delays in construction, and now, unexpected leaks. She couldn't help but wonder if the team, and especially Elon, fully understood the weight of the challenges they were facing. As she walked back to her office, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Mrs. Franklin. "I need to see you in my office. Now." Clara's stomach churned. "What now?" Clara pushed open Mrs. Franklin's office door, only to find the financial officer sitting behind her desk, her face grim. "We need to talk about your position here at the hospital." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She'd known there were risks with the project, but she hadn't expected this. Clara felt the weight of Mrs. Franklin's words hanging in the air. Her heart raced as she closed the door behind her and took a seat across from the financial officer. The tension in the room was palpable, and Clara couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of the end for her role in the hospital's future. Mrs. Franklin didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Clara, I've been reviewing the situation with the construction project, and frankly, we're not seeing the results we anticipated. The costs are spiraling out of control, the disruptions are becoming unbearable, and the staff is becoming more and more vocal about their concerns. I'm concerned that you're too emotionally involved to make the tough decisions needed to move forward." Clara's pulse quickened. She hadn't expected such a direct confrontation. She had poured her heart into this project, trying to balance the needs of the staff and the hospital's long-term goals. To hear that Mrs. Franklin thought she was too emotionally involved stung. "I'm invested because I believe in this hospital and its future," Clara said, her voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling up inside her. "We're facing challenges, yes, but that doesn't mean we abandon the project. We just need to find solutions." Mrs. Franklin sighed, her fingers tapping against the desk. "Clara, I'm not saying we abandon the project, but we need someone who can make hard choices without letting personal attachments cloud their judgment. I'm not sure you're the right person to lead this anymore." Clara's throat tightened. She'd worked so hard to get to this point. It wasn't just about the hospital. It was about proving that she could handle something this big, something that could change everything. But now, Mrs. Franklin was questioning her capability. "I understand your concerns," Clara said, taking a deep breath. "But I believe in this hospital's potential. If we abandon it now, we risk everything we've worked for. I'm committed to making it work. I just need the time and support to do so." There was a long pause before Mrs. Franklin responded, her voice softer than before. "I'm not the one who gets to decide that, Clara, but I think you should have a conversation with Elon. He's been pushing for a lot of these changes, and he needs to see how the staff is really feeling. Maybe it's time to reevaluate the direction we're going." Clara nodded slowly, her mind spinning. She knew the conversation with Elon wouldn't be easy, but it seemed like it was the only way forward. If she couldn't make him see what the hospital truly needed, she might lose everything: the project, the trust of the staff, and her own position in the hospital. The next day, Clara met with Elon in his office. He was surrounded by blueprints and architectural plans, the walls filled with ideas for the hospital's future. But Clara wasn't interested in ideas right now. She needed to make him see the human side of all these changes. "Elon," Clara began, her voice firm, "we need to talk about the direction of this project." He glanced up from his papers, his expression unreadable. "Of course, Clara. What's on your mind?" "This project is causing a lot of strain on the staff," Clara said, her voice softening slightly as she spoke. "The disruptions, the extended hours, the uncertainty. It's wearing them down. I understand the vision you have for the hospital, but we need to be mindful of the people who will have to make it work. If we don't start listening to their concerns, this project will fail. And I don't think that's what either of us wants." Elon leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he considered her words. "I've heard some of the complaints, but I still believe the long-term benefits outweigh the short-term discomfort." Clara shook her head. "The staff is at a breaking point, and if we don't address their concerns, they won't be around to see the benefits. We can't keep pushing them like this." There was a moment of silence between them, the tension thick in the air. Elon's gaze remained steady, but Clara could see the conflict behind his eyes. This wasn't just a business decision for him. It was personal, too. "I know you've put a lot of yourself into this," Clara continued, "but we need to find a balance. We can't sacrifice the people who make this hospital run in order to build something grand." Elon's eyes softened, and he finally spoke. "I didn't realize it had gotten this bad. I thought we were making progress, but if the staff is this upset, then we need to reassess." Clara's shoulders relaxed a fraction, relieved that Elon was finally starting to understand the gravity of the situation. "We need to take a step back, reevaluate our priorities. And above all, we need to listen to the people who make this hospital what it is." Elon nodded, his mind already working through the changes that might be necessary. "You're right. I've been so focused on the bigger picture that I lost sight of what's happening on the ground. Let's find a way to make it right." Clara's heart lifted slightly. It wasn't a complete solution yet, but it was a start. She'd planted the seed, and now it was up to Elon to help it grow. As Clara walked out of Elon's office, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were at a crossroads. This project could still succeed, but only if they were willing to make some difficult decisions and put the people who worked there first. She wasn't sure if Elon fully understood the depth of the changes required, but she was willing to fight for it. The hospital meant too much to her, and to the people who depended on it, for her to give up now. But she also knew that the next few weeks would be crucial. The pressure was mounting, and it wasn't just about construction anymore. It was about trust, balance, and whether they could find a way to move forward together. As Clara made her way to the nurse's station, she received a text from Mrs. Franklin. It was short and to the point. "We need to talk again. This is getting worse." Clara's stomach sank. She had done what she could with Elon, but the battle was far from over. She wasn't sure what the next meeting would bring, but she knew one thing for sure: the future of the hospital hung in the balance. The next few days felt like a blur to Clara. Every step she took seemed to be weighed down by the uncertainty of what was to come. The hospital's hallways, once filled with the comforting hum of activity, now echoed with whispers of frustration. It was clear that the staff's patience was wearing thin, and their discontent was growing by the hour. Clara couldn't help but wonder if the decision she made to push for change had been the right one. She'd asked Elon to listen to the concerns of the staff, but would he really follow through? More importantly, could they salvage the project without losing the faith of the very people who had made this hospital what it was? Her phone buzzed as she sat down in the break room, the familiar ping signaling a new message. She glanced at the screen, her stomach tightening when she saw that it was from Mrs. Franklin. "We need to meet again. Now. It's urgent." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She quickly gathered her things and headed toward Mrs. Franklin's office, hoping she wasn't walking into a complete disaster. When she arrived, Mrs. Franklin was already sitting behind her desk, the lines of worry etched deeply into her face. Clara, thank you for coming so quickly. There's something you need to know. Clara nodded, trying to brace herself. What's going on? Mrs. Franklin hesitated, clearly struggling with what she had to say. The board is having serious concerns about the future of the project. The costs have escalated far beyond what was initially projected, and now they're questioning whether we should continue at all. They're already considering pulling the plug? Clara's stomach dropped. This was the last thing she needed to hear. She had just managed to get Elon on board with the idea of scaling back, and now it seemed like everything was on the verge of collapse. Is there any way to change their minds? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. What if we showed them how committed the staff is to making this work? We've been through so much already. It's not just about the money. It's about the future. Mrs. Franklin shook her head slowly. They're not listening to that. They want results, Clara. Hard, undeniable results. And right now, they don't see them. You're in the middle of a perfect storm, and I'm afraid it might be too late to fix it. Clara felt her pulse quicken. She had spent so much time trying to balance the needs of the staff, the hospital, and Elon's vision, but she had never anticipated this level of resistance from the board. Her eyes drifted to the window, the weight of the situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. Is there anyone who can help? Clara asked, more out of desperation than hope. Mrs. Franklin leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as though she was weighing her options. There's one person who could help, but I'm not sure you'll like it. Clara raised an eyebrow. Who? Elon Musk, Mrs. Franklin said, her voice almost a whisper. He has the influence and the resources to turn this around. But here's the problem. He's the one who got us into this mess in the first place. Clara's eyes widened. She had hoped Elon would be part of the solution, not the problem. You think he can save us? Mrs. Franklin shrugged. It's either him or the board. If we don't get Elon's full backing, this project is dead in the water. The next day, Clara found herself sitting across from Elon again. But this time, the mood was different. He was no longer just the entrepreneur with a vision. He was the person who held the key to the hospital's future. Clara's nerves were on edge as she explained everything that had happened since their last meeting. The increasing pressure from the board, the escalating costs, and the staff's growing discontent. I didn't realize it had gotten this bad, Elon said, his face filled with concern. I thought the project was going well, but it sounds like we've missed the mark. Clara nodded. It's not just about the numbers anymore, Elon. It's about the people, the ones who make this hospital run every single day. If they feel like their concerns aren't being heard, we lose their trust. And without that, we'll never get the results we need. Elon looked thoughtful for a moment before speaking. What do you need from me, Clara? I need you to back me up, Clara said, her voice firm. The board is ready to pull the plug on the project. If we don't show them that this is worth saving, it's all over. I'm asking you to do what you do best. Get them to see the bigger picture. Elon leaned back in his chair, his eyes focused on Clara. I'll talk to the board. But it's not just about getting their approval. We need to find a way to make this hospital function in a way that everyone can support. I can't promise it'll be easy, but I'll do whatever I can to help. Clara's heart lifted slightly. This was the breakthrough she needed. If Elon could get the board on board, they might just be able to turn things around. But there was still so much work to do. As Clara left Elon's office, she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope, tempered with caution. She had just secured Elon's support, but the real challenge was ahead. She needed to convince the board that they weren't just throwing money at a failing project. They needed to see that the hospital was worth fighting for, and that it wasn't just a business venture, but a lifeline for the community. The pressure was mounting, but Clara knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to give up without a fight. Clara's phone buzzed again, the text from Mrs. Franklin sending a chill down her spine. They're meeting tomorrow. We need to be ready. As she read the message, Clara's mind raced. Tomorrow could be the turning point, or the end of everything. The morning light filtered through Clara's office window, but she barely noticed. The weight of the upcoming board meeting felt like an anchor pulling her down. She was about to walk into the biggest challenge of her career, and the stakes had never been higher. The project, the hospital, and the future of everyone involved hung in the balance. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything could come crashing down. Clara had spent the night preparing for the meeting, reviewing every document, every proposal, and every possible outcome. She had rehearsed her arguments until they were second nature, but that didn't make the situation any less intimidating. It was the moment of truth, and it was coming fast. She arrived at the boardroom early, wanting to get settled before the storm hit. The room was long and sleek, with polished wood tables and walls adorned with abstract art. It felt too sterile, too impersonal for the kind of conversation they were about to have. Clara's palms were sweating as she arranged her notes, her mind racing through all the things that could go wrong. As the clock ticked closer to the meeting time, Clara heard footsteps in the hallway. She turned to see Mrs. Franklin entering the room, her face tense but resolute. "We're running out of time," Mrs. Franklin said, taking a seat next to Clara. "The board is anxious, and the pressure is mounting. Elon should be here soon, but we need to be ready for anything." Clara nodded. She had heard about Elon's reputation for making waves and being unpredictable. He wasn't like most businessmen. His mind worked in ways that often left people guessing. But this time, she wasn't going to let the chaos throw her off balance. She had too much to lose. Just as Clara was about to speak, the door swung open and Elon entered. He walked in with his usual confident stride, his expression a mix of focus and determination. Clara couldn't help but notice the contrast between him and the rest of the board members, who were already seated around the table, waiting with crossed arms and skeptical glances. Without wasting time, Elon took a seat at the head of the table. His eyes scanned the room, assessing the atmosphere before he addressed the group. "Let's get this over with. We all know why we're here." The board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly taken aback by Elon's bluntness. But Clara couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. This was exactly the kind of no-nonsense approach that could work. Mrs. Franklin cleared her throat and stood up to speak. "We've gathered today to discuss the future of the hospital project. As you all know, we're facing significant financial challenges, and the board has expressed concerns about continuing with the project. However, we believe there is a way forward, but we need your support." The board members exchanged wary glances, their skepticism palpable. Clara's heart raced as she prepared to speak, but she knew she couldn't do this alone. Elon had to be her ally in this moment. She looked to him, silently asking for his support. Elon leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "I've been watching this project closely, and I believe in its potential. This hospital has the capacity to make a real difference, not just in the community, but in the healthcare industry as a whole. But the staff, the people who make this place work every day, they need to know that their concerns are being heard." Clara could feel the weight of the room shift as Elon spoke. His words were powerful, and for the first time in a long while, the board members seemed to be listening. But the chairman, Mr. Harris, spoke up, his tone icy. "And what do you propose we do, Mr. Musk? The financials are a mess, and you've done little to ease the concerns of the board. What makes you think you can fix this now?" Elon didn't flinch. "I didn't come here to fix things with a quick-fix solution. What I'm offering is a commitment to the long-term success of this hospital. We need to recalibrate, scale back where necessary, and most importantly, we need to focus on the people. I'm willing to invest more resources into this, but we need to ensure that the staff feels like they are part of this vision, not just a cog in a machine." Clara couldn't have agreed more. The tension in the room was palpable, but she felt a surge of confidence. "We've already seen the potential of this hospital. We've made strides in creating a space that's not just about treating patients, but about creating a community. But we need the board's support to keep moving forward. This hospital can still be the future of healthcare, but it can't happen without all of us working together." The board members were quiet, clearly contemplating the direction they were being led. Clara's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment she had worked for, the moment that would determine everything. Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as if deep in thought. "So, let me get this straight. You're asking us to trust you, to give this project more time and resources, and you're promising that the staff will be on board with this new direction?" Elon's gaze never wavered. "Yes. I'm not just asking for your trust. I'm offering mine. I'll match the board's commitment with my own investment and ensure that the staff has everything they need to succeed. But I need you to believe in the vision we're building here. We all have a stake in this. Mrs. Franklin, who had been silently observing, spoke up. We've seen the progress. It's not perfect, but it's a start. If we can make the necessary adjustments and prove that we can move forward without sacrificing the integrity of the hospital, we can turn this around. The tension in the room seemed to lift slightly as the board members exchanged glances. Clara couldn't quite read their expressions, but she held her breath, hoping they would see what she saw. Finally, Mr. Harris nodded, breaking the silence. We'll give it one last shot. But understand this, Mr. Musk. The clock is ticking. We need results soon. Clara exhaled, a feeling of relief washing over her. They had bought themselves more time, but it wasn't over yet. They still had to prove themselves. As Clara and Elon walked out of the boardroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was only just beginning. They had won a small victory, but the road ahead was uncertain. Would the staff rally behind them? Would the changes they had promised be enough to save the hospital? Only time would tell, but Clara was determined to see it through. Clara sat in her car outside the hospital, staring at the building before her. The weight of the board meeting still pressed on her shoulders, but now it was mixed with a sense of urgency. The decision had been made, another chance for the hospital, but now it was time for action. The promises made in that sterile boardroom had to become something real, something tangible. If they didn't, all the effort, all the investment, would be for nothing. As Clara stepped into the hospital, the usual hum of activity greeted her. The nurses were on their rounds, patients were in their rooms, and the waiting areas were filled with families and loved ones. But Clara knew that this was just the surface. Beneath it all, something had changed. The board had agreed to continue the project, but the real work had only just begun. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Mrs. Franklin. We have a meeting with the department heads in an hour. Let's talk strategy. Clara felt her pulse quicken. She had known this was coming, but the reality of it hit her now. They needed a plan. Something that would convince not just the board, but the staff and the community that this hospital was worth saving. She couldn't let them down. An hour later, Clara was in the conference room with Mrs. Franklin and the department heads. The room was filled with tension as they began the meeting. There were murmurs of skepticism among the staff. They had heard promises before, but this time, Clara couldn't afford for the same mistakes to be made. Mrs. Franklin stood first, addressing the group. We've received a green light from the board to continue the project, but we need to make changes, big changes, and we need your cooperation. Clara's eyes scanned the room. The department heads were seasoned professionals, but they were tired. They had been through too many rounds of disappointment. If they were going to buy into this new vision, it was up to her to show them that it wasn't just talk. The financial situation is still critical, Clara began, standing up to address the group. But we've come up with a plan to adjust. We're going to scale back on non-essential expenditures, focus on the departments that need the most attention, and make sure that we are providing the best possible care to our patients. We are not going to let this hospital fail. She saw a few skeptical glances exchanged, but Clara didn't back down. We have to prove to the board that we can deliver on our promises. We have to show them that we have a plan, and that we have the heart to make this work. The room was silent for a moment, and Clara's heart raced. She could feel the weight of their doubts, but she also knew that they were listening. Slowly, the murmurs died down, and she felt a shift. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to believe her. That evening, Clara received a call from Elon. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that she hadn't heard before. Clara, we need to talk about the next steps. We've got one shot at this, and I want to make sure we're doing everything right. Clara leaned against her desk, exhausted but determined. I know. We're having a meeting with the staff tonight to go over the changes we're implementing. They're hesitant, but they're starting to listen. I don't want you to just get them to listen. I want you to get them to buy in. If we don't have their support, all of this is meaningless, Elon replied. Clara nodded, despite the phone call being over. She understood what he meant. If they couldn't get the department heads and the rest of the hospital staff to buy into the vision, all the changes, all the money, would be for nothing. She couldn't fail. Not now. The following days were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and adjusting to the new reality. Clara and Mrs. Franklin worked around the clock to make the necessary changes, but the road was anything but smooth. The department heads continued to raise concerns, and the staff was still wary of the promises being made. Every step forward seemed to come with a dozen steps back. But there was something different now. Clara could feel the shift. People were starting to come together. The atmosphere in the hospital, while still tense, was charged with a new kind of energy. Clara couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she knew the tide was turning. One evening, as she walked down the corridor after another long day, Clara ran into Maria, the nurse who had helped her during the early days of the project. Maria smiled at Clara, her eyes bright with hope. "I heard about the changes," Maria said, her voice quiet but full of conviction. "I just wanted to say that I believe in what you're doing. This hospital, it's been my home for so long. If anyone can turn this around, it's you." Clara felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. Maria's words were exactly what she needed to hear. They were starting to believe. "Thank you, Maria," Clara said softly. "It's going to take all of us, but I know we can do it." Maria nodded. "We're with you. All of us." As Clara walked away from the conversation, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something monumental. The road ahead was still fraught with challenges, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. If the staff was behind her, if the board could be convinced, then maybe, just maybe, they could save this hospital. The following morning was cloudy, the kind of gray sky that matched Clara's mood. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts about the hospital's future, the board's expectations, and her own personal limitations. This wasn't just a job to her anymore. It felt like a personal mission. If she couldn't pull this off, there was no telling what would happen to the people who had trusted her. Clara arrived early at the hospital. The staff was already buzzing with activity, preparing for another long day. But Clara couldn't ignore the knot in her stomach. She had agreed to meet with the department heads again to review the new operational plans and finalize the budget allocations. This was the day they had to decide whether or not to proceed with the next phase of the changes. The pressure was on, and Clara could feel it weighing heavily on her. As Clara walked down the familiar hallway toward the meeting room, she saw familiar faces, nurses, janitors, technicians, all of them working tirelessly, as they always had. But now, something felt different. The hospital was changing. Clara just hoped it was changing for the better. Inside the meeting room, Mrs. Franklin was already seated, reviewing the new budget proposals. The department heads were scattered around the table, some looking skeptical, others uncertain, and a few trying to mask their anxiety. Clara could feel the tension in the air, a palpable presence that made her wonder whether all her hard work was enough. "Good morning, everyone," Clara began, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We have a lot to cover today, but I want to start by saying that I'm confident we're on the right track. The changes we're implementing are necessary, and I believe they will help us turn this hospital around." There was a silence before Dr. Harris, the head of surgery, cleared his throat. "Clara, I have to be honest. I'm still not sure about some of these changes. Cutting back on non-essential services, while understandable, could mean that some patients may not get the care they need in a timely manner." Clara nodded, understanding his concern. "I hear you, Dr. Harris, but we have to make tough decisions right now. We can't keep operating the way we were. The finances simply won't allow for it. But I promise you, we're not cutting corners. The goal is to streamline our processes without sacrificing the quality of care." She turned her attention to the others. Dr. Harris wasn't the only one raising doubts. Dr. Patel, the head of the emergency department, spoke up next. "I've been thinking about staffing," Dr. Patel said. "Reducing staff hours, while necessary, will likely slow response times, and that could have serious consequences, especially in the emergency department. I'm worried about how this will affect patient outcomes." Clara felt her heart rate quicken. These were serious concerns, and she had expected them. But this wasn't a time for hesitation. It was time to reassure the team. "I understand your concerns, Dr. Patel," Clara replied. "That's why we're focusing on increasing efficiency and leveraging technology to make up for the staffing reductions. We're also bringing in additional training to make sure that every shift is as effective as possible." There was another round of silence as everyone processed her words. Clara could see the skepticism in their eyes, but she also saw a flicker of something else. Hope. Maybe they were still here. They were still listening. And that was something. But just as Clara was starting to feel a glimmer of progress, the door opened. A young nurse, Michelle, poked her head inside the room, her face pale. Clara, I need to speak with you. It's urgent. Clara stood immediately, excusing herself from the meeting. The room erupted into quiet murmurs, but Clara didn't have time to address them. She followed Michelle out into the hallway, anxiety flooding her as the nurse led her to the emergency department. What's going on, Michelle? Clara asked, her voice steady despite the unease crawling up her spine. It's the pediatric ward, Michelle said, her voice tight with panic. There's been a mix-up. The new medication batch we received, it's faulty. Several patients have started showing allergic reactions. We're trying to stabilize them, but, Clara, we might lose some of them. Clara's stomach dropped. The pediatric ward was one of the most important areas of the hospital. If this was as bad as Michelle said, it could be a disaster. And if word got out, the damage to the hospital's reputation could be irreparable. Get me in touch with the head of pediatrics. Now, Clara said, her voice cold with determination. Within moments, Clara was standing in front of Dr. Jenkins, the head of pediatrics, who was frantically overseeing the situation. The ward was chaos. Nurses running in and out of rooms, doctors shouting instructions, and the hum of monitors filling the air. Clara, Dr. Jenkins said, her face drawn with exhaustion. I'm so sorry. We don't know what went wrong, but we're doing everything we can. Clara grabbed a nearby chart and scanned the information. The reactions were severe, but the doctors were doing everything they could to stabilize the children. Her heart ached as she saw the tiny faces of the patients, their families anxiously waiting outside. We need to act quickly, Clara said, her mind racing. Call in the lab, make sure they confirm the problem, and get a plan together. I'll handle the board. We can't let this get out of control. As she stepped back into the hallway, Clara felt the weight of the situation settle on her. The hospital was teetering on the edge. One mistake, one small misstep, could send everything crashing down. As Clara walked back to the meeting room, her thoughts were clouded with worry. The mix-up in the pediatric ward was a huge setback, and the board would have to be informed. But Clara couldn't afford to let this derail everything they'd worked for. If she didn't find a solution soon, the consequences could be far worse than anyone had anticipated. The tension in the hospital was palpable. Clara's footsteps echoed down the long hallways as she made her way back to the board meeting, her mind heavy with the crisis that had just unfolded in the pediatric ward. It wasn't just a simple mix-up. The medication issue could spell disaster for the hospital's reputation. If the wrong people got wind of it, it could be the end of everything she and her team had worked for. As she entered the meeting room, all eyes turned to her, a mixture of concern and curiosity on their faces. Mrs. Franklin, as usual, was poised and unreadable, but Clara could tell she was already sensing the change in the air. There was no hiding the urgency in Clara's stride. I'm sorry, but I need to address something immediately, Clara said, her voice firm despite the anxiety clawing at her chest. She took her seat, looking directly at Mrs. Franklin and the others. There's been an incident in the pediatric ward. A batch of medication we received was faulty. Several of our young patients have started showing severe allergic reactions. We're doing everything we can to stabilize them, but the situation is critical. There was a collective gasp around the table. Clara could see the color drain from the faces of some of the department heads. Dr. Harris was the first to speak. This is a nightmare. How could this happen? He asked, his voice tight with disbelief. We rely on those medications. What do we do now? Clara exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. We're working with the lab to confirm what went wrong. The pediatric team is doing everything in their power to stabilize the children. But I need everyone to understand that we can't let this leak out. If this becomes public, it could ruin us. The room fell into a tense silence as the board members absorbed what she had said. Mrs. Franklin leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly together. Clara, I trust you understand the gravity of the situation, she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. But you have to be honest with us. What's our plan here? How do we protect the hospital? Clara's mind was racing. She had always been a problem solver, but this was different. This wasn't just about saving face. This was about saving lives. The medication crisis had to be contained, and the only way to do that was with transparency and decisive action. We need to contain the issue, Clara said, her voice unwavering. I'm going to call a meeting with the medical board, explain the situation, and make sure we have a strategy in place to handle the fallout. We also need to reach out to the families affected. Full transparency is key right now. The longer we wait, the worse this will get. Mrs. Franklin nodded, a stern look crossing her face. I agree. But Clara, you have to understand that we are also facing budget cuts and operational decisions that have to move forward. We can't afford to delay anything, even with this setback. Clara's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. The patients come first. If we can't ensure their safety, then none of the other decisions matter. I'll handle the logistics and the PR, but I need your support on this. There was a moment of hesitation before Dr. Patel, the head of emergency services, spoke up. Clara's right. If we don't focus on patient care right now, nothing else will matter. We'll lose the trust of everyone, the staff, the patients, the community. The board members exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. But the pressure was still mounting, the weight of the decision heavy in the air. Clara could feel the entire room holding its breath. Meanwhile, back in the pediatric ward, Clara's team was working around the clock to manage the crisis. The medical staff had administered emergency treatments to the affected children, and the lab had confirmed that the medication batch contained an unlisted ingredient that caused the allergic reactions. Thankfully, no fatalities had occurred yet, but the situation was still dire. Clara couldn't help but feel a wave of guilt wash over her as she watched the doctors and nurses working tirelessly. She had been so focused on the big picture changes that she hadn't seen this coming. Now, she was stuck trying to manage the aftermath while keeping the hospital afloat. Clara, Michelle said, stepping into the room where Clara was standing. We've got a problem. The families of the affected children are starting to ask questions. They want to know what happened and why they weren't warned. Clara turned, her mind already calculating the next steps. We need to get ahead of this. Contact the families and assure them that we're doing everything we can. And get a statement ready for the media. We'll be transparent about what happened, but we need to manage how it's communicated. Michelle nodded, clearly nervous but determined. I'll take care of it. Clara watched her leave, her own heart pounding in her chest. The next few hours would be critical. One wrong move, one slip-up, and it could all come crashing down. Back in the meeting room, Clara returned to the board after a long, stressful hour of coordinating with her team. Mrs. Franklin's expression had softened slightly, but she could still sense the unease in the room. Clara couldn't afford to back down now. This was her hospital, and she was the one who had to make the tough decisions. We've got a plan, Clara said, taking her seat again. The pediatric team is managing the immediate crisis, and we've prepared a statement for the families and the press. I'm confident we can handle this, but I need full support from everyone here. Dr. Harris spoke up again. Clara, I understand the urgency, but we also have to focus on the future. We can't let this incident derail all the progress we've made. Clara nodded. I know, and that's why I'm asking for your help. We have to rebuild trust with the public and our patients. The next step is to make sure we're not just reacting, but taking proactive measures to prevent something like this from happening again. Clara's heart was pounding as she stood in front of the board, knowing that the choices she made in the next few hours could decide the future of the hospital. She had always been a fighter, but this time, the stakes felt higher than ever. Would the hospital survive the fallout from the medication crisis, or would Clara's efforts be in vain? Clara paced the narrow corridors of the hospital, her thoughts racing as she processed the events that had unfolded. The worst part was that she didn't know if they were out of the woods yet. The medication crisis was still ongoing, and though they had managed to stabilize the children, Clara knew that the real battle was just beginning. With every passing hour, the pressure to act decisively mounted. She had already communicated with the families of the affected children, offering her sincerest apologies and reassuring them that the hospital was doing everything it could to fix the situation. But Clara knew that the damage had been done, trust had been shaken, and it would take more than a few words to restore it. The meeting with the board had been equally tense. Mrs. Franklin had remained quiet throughout most of the discussion, offering her support but also reminding Clara that the financial health of the hospital was at stake. Clara understood the weight of that, but she also knew that prioritizing profits over patient care was a dangerous road to go down. Now, as she stepped into her office, her phone buzzed on the desk, and she immediately grabbed it. It was a message from Michelle. "The press is outside. They want a statement. How do you want to handle this?" Clara ran a hand through her hair, feeling the weight of her responsibilities bear down on her. She had expected this moment to come, but that didn't make it any easier. She took a deep breath, composing herself before replying. "Get the media relations team on the phone. We need to make a public statement immediately. Let's control the narrative." As Clara waited for Michelle's response, she glanced at the file on her desk. Another reminder of the storm brewing. The hospital's future hung in the balance. If they didn't handle the crisis with care and precision, there could be consequences far beyond a simple loss of reputation. The media, the families, and even the staff were watching closely to see how they would navigate this disaster. Meanwhile, the pediatric team was still working tirelessly, keeping the affected children under observation while ensuring that the remaining medication was safe to administer. Dr. Harris had been the most vocal during the board meeting, urging everyone to focus on finding the root cause of the issue. Clara had promised him she would initiate a full investigation, but right now, all she could do was rely on her team to keep the situation under control. In the middle of her thoughts, Michelle walked in, holding a tablet and a notepad. A look of concern etched on her face. "Clara, the media is starting to make waves. Some of the major outlets are picking up the story already. We need to get ahead of it," Michelle said, setting the tablet down on Clara's desk. Clara leaned forward, scanning the headlines. The words "hospital medication crisis" and "pediatric patients affected" stood out in bold. The media was already sensationalizing the situation, fueling the fear and uncertainty that Clara had been trying so hard to manage. "We can't wait any longer," Clara muttered, her voice tense. "We need to release a statement now. A clear, honest statement, and we need to make it personal." Michelle nodded. "I'll get our PR team on it right away." Within the hour, Clara stood before a small group of reporters, the hospital's media relations team by her side. The flashing cameras and the barrage of questions made her heart race, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had a message to deliver, and she wouldn't let the media take control of the narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today," Clara began, her voice steady. "I'm here to address the recent concerns regarding a medication error in our pediatric ward. First and foremost, I want to extend my deepest apologies to the families affected. We are doing everything in our power to ensure the safety and well-being of every patient here at St. Luke's Hospital." The cameras clicked as she spoke, and Clara could feel the weight of every word. She couldn't afford to falter now. "We are fully committed to transparency, and I want to assure everyone that we are conducting a thorough investigation into this issue. Our priority right now is to make sure that all of our young patients receive the care they need to recover. We are working with leading medical professionals to ensure that such an incident never happens again." She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the reporters. This was the moment where she had to make it clear that the hospital's commitment to its patients was unwavering. "We will not rest until this situation is resolved," Clara continued, her voice unwavering. "And I personally promise that we will take every necessary step to regain your trust and the trust of the families who have placed their faith in us." With that, she finished her statement and turned to leave, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. There was no turning back now. Back in her office, Clara exhaled slowly, trying to calm her racing pulse. The press conference had gone well, better than she expected, but the true challenge was still ahead. She had no idea how long it would take to restore the hospital's reputation, or if the fallout would be as catastrophic as she feared. All she knew was that this was a defining moment in her career, and she had to make the right choices. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see Michelle entering, her face serious. "We have an update on the investigation," Michelle said. "The initial findings suggest the problem was with the supplier. The batch of medication was contaminated before it even arrived here. Clara's shoulders sagged in relief, but there was still a long road ahead. That's good news, but it doesn't change what's happened. We'll need to work with the supplier to make sure this doesn't happen again. Michelle nodded. Of course, but we've got a team on it. I'll make sure the details are handled. Clara gave her a small smile. Thank you, Michelle. Let's keep moving forward. We can't stop now. Clara stood at the window of her office, looking out at the city as the sun began to set. The media frenzy would die down. The investigation would continue, but the real challenge was yet to come. How would the hospital rebuild its reputation in the face of such a public disaster? Could Clara ensure that the mistakes of today didn't repeat themselves tomorrow? The answers would shape the future of St. Luke's Hospital and Clara's own future forever. Clara sat at her desk, the weight of the day's events settling over her like a thick fog. The media storm had subsided, but the storm within the hospital was far from over. The investigation into the contaminated medication was progressing, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched from every angle. Her every decision, every word, was now under intense scrutiny. The phone on her desk buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced down and saw Michelle's name on the caller ID. Clara picked it up, her nerves still on edge. Clara, Michelle's voice came through, calm but firm. We've got another issue. The families of the affected children want to meet with you. They're requesting an in-person meeting, and they're demanding answers. Clara felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't unexpected, but it didn't make it any easier. These families had trusted St. Luke's with their children's care, and now, after the crisis, they wanted to know why it had happened and what the hospital was doing to make sure it never happened again. Schedule the meeting, Clara said, her voice steady despite the knots in her stomach. I'll meet with them. It's time to face this head-on. The meeting was set for the following afternoon. Clara spent the night reviewing every detail of the case. The hospital's responses, the investigation updates, and, most importantly, the faces of the children who had been affected. She wasn't just the hospital administrator anymore. She was their advocate, their protector, and she needed to be prepared to answer tough questions. When the families arrived at St. Luke's the next day, Clara greeted them in the conference room, where they had been seated around a long table. There was a sense of tension in the air, a mix of hurt and anger. Clara could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the quiet determination to get the answers they deserved. Thank you for coming, Clara said, her voice soft yet firm. I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am for what has happened. I know that no words can undo the pain and fear you felt, but please know that we are doing everything we can to make this right. The parents exchanged glances but said nothing. Clara could feel the weight of their silence. She continued, laying out the details of the investigation into the contaminated medication and the steps they were taking to rectify the situation. We've already removed the affected batch of medication from circulation, and we're working with the supplier to ensure this doesn't happen again, she explained. We're also offering all affected children continued care and support free of charge for as long as necessary. A father at the table, his face lined with worry, leaned forward. That's not enough, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. Our kids were put at risk because of a failure on your part. What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else? Clara nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. You're right. It's not enough. We are implementing new safeguards for every batch of medication that comes into this hospital. We're also revising our procedures for checking and testing medications. This will never happen again. The room fell silent for a moment as the parents took in Clara's words. She knew it wasn't enough to simply promise change. She had to prove it, not just with words, but with action. I also want to offer you all something, Clara continued. We'll be setting up a fund to cover any medical expenses related to the crisis, and we'll be offering each of your families counseling services. We want to support you through this, not just now, but in the long term. The parents exchanged looks, some nodding in appreciation. Others, however, remained unconvinced. We need more than just promises, one mother said. We need accountability. Clara took a deep breath. I understand. I will personally oversee the investigation and make sure that we hold anyone responsible accountable. I'm committed to transparency, and I will ensure that every step of the process is done with the utmost integrity. She paused for a moment, meeting their gazes. And if there is anything more we can do to help you and your children, we will do it. There was a long pause before another father spoke up. We'll hold you to that, he said, his voice calm but firm. Clara nodded. I expect nothing less. After the meeting, Clara retreated to her office, her mind spinning with the parents' words. They had given her their trust, but she knew that trust was fragile. Every decision moving forward would need to be made carefully, with the awareness that the eyes of the hospital, the community, and even the media were upon her. She picked up her phone and sent a message to Michelle. Let's set up a task force. We need to put in place the new protocols ASAP. Michelle replied almost immediately, Got it. We'll start first thing tomorrow. Clara leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the window. The road ahead would be difficult. The investigation was far from over, and the healing process would take time. But Clara was determined. She had faced crises before, but this was different. The stakes were higher. The eyes of the world were watching, and she couldn't afford to fail. She picked up the phone again, dialing a number she knew well. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Elon, Clara said when he picked up. I need your help. Elon Musk listened intently as Clara explained the situation. It wasn't just a matter of fixing a hospital's reputation anymore. It was about repairing trust on a much larger scale. Could the billionaire entrepreneur lend his expertise and influence to help guide St. Luke's through the storm? The next few days would reveal whether Clara's gamble would pay off, or if the hospital's fate had already been sealed. Clara sat in her office, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the floor. The quiet hum of the hospital's evening routine seemed almost peaceful compared to the storm of emotions and decisions she had navigated earlier in the day. But that sense of peace was fleeting. She had just made the call to Elon Musk, and now she waited, hoping his involvement could turn the tide. She glanced at the clock. Another 30 minutes passed. She had hoped to hear back from Elon sooner, but maybe it was too much to expect a quick response from someone with his vast empire of companies to manage. As her phone buzzed, Clara's heart skipped a beat. It was an unknown number. Taking a deep breath, she answered, Clara Thompson. Elon Musk here, came the calm, yet undeniably confident voice on the other end. You wanted to talk? Clara's pulse quickened. She had only met Elon a few times at hospital fundraisers, but she had always admired his ability to tackle big problems head-on. If anyone could help them navigate the aftermath of this disaster, it was him. Yes, she began, her voice steady but earnest. I need your help. St. Luke's is in the middle of a public relations nightmare. The investigation into the contaminated medication is still ongoing, but the damage to the hospital's reputation is severe. I'm doing everything I can to address the family's concerns, but I need resources, expertise, guidance, something beyond what we can do on our own. There was a brief pause before Elon replied, his voice thoughtful. I've seen your work, Clara. I know you've got the right heart in this, but what you need is more than just damage control. This isn't just about a hospital. It's about an entire community's trust. If you want to fix this, we need to go big. What's your plan? Clara bit her lip. She had already been thinking about the scope of the solution, but it was one thing to draft strategies in the quiet of her office, and another to pitch them to someone like Elon Musk. I want to create a comprehensive, transparent system that includes not only fixing the issues with the medication supply, but also setting up real-time health monitoring and safety measures for every patient who walks through the door. I want a technological overhaul of how we track medication and ensure patient safety. We'll use advanced AI to monitor everything, batch testing, patient reactions, even employee health standards. It's a multi-million-dollar project, but I think we could do it. Elon's voice broke through the silence. You're thinking big. I like it. But that's going to take more than just tech. You'll need external oversight, accountability, and perhaps some of my partners to help you rebuild public trust. People won't just want to fix. They'll want to guarantee that it won't happen again. Clara felt a rush of relief. Elon wasn't just listening. He was already brainstorming solutions. What do you suggest? She asked, her hope rising. Well, first, you're going to need someone with credibility. I'll talk to a few people I know, some who have experience managing public health crises. We'll get the right people in your corner, he said. Second, we're going to make this transparent. If we're going to do this, we need the world to see what you're doing, every step of the way. I'll help you set up a public-facing platform, and we'll involve the media, but only when we're ready. If we can make this work, we can turn St. Luke's into an example of accountability, of doing it the right way. Clara leaned forward, absorbing his words. So you're in? I'm in, Elon confirmed without hesitation. I'll have my team reach out to yours in the morning. We'll make sure this goes off without a hitch. The phone call ended, but Clara remained in her chair for several minutes, her mind racing. Elon Musk, the man behind some of the most innovative companies in the world, was on her side. His influence, his resources, they could make a difference. She was no longer facing this crisis alone. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Clara and her team worked closely with Elon's associates, who helped bring in a cadre of experts from various fields: tech specialists, healthcare consultants, PR professionals, and even legal advisors. Together, they formulated a detailed plan to address every angle of the crisis. Meanwhile, the media coverage of St. Luke's continued to intensify. The families of the affected children were still holding strong, demanding action. Their voices were powerful, and Clara knew that they had every right to be angry. But now, with Elon's involvement, there was hope. There was a real path forward. The plan they devised was nothing short of ambitious. Clara would implement a new, tech-driven infrastructure for the hospital, with AI monitoring patient data and medication supplies in real time. There would be a public-facing platform where patients could track their own health and report any concerns. There would also be a dedicated task force for oversight, including external auditors and safety experts. Elon's team was already preparing to introduce the first phase of their technological upgrades, and Clara couldn't help but feel a surge of optimism. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick, but they were on the right track. The following week, Clara received the first piece of good news in days. The hospital's legal team had worked out a settlement with one of the affected families, one that would hopefully prevent further public backlash. It was a small win, but it was something. Every step forward was a victory. The press conference was scheduled for the following month. This would be their moment to tell the world what they were doing to prevent this from ever happening again. Clara had rehearsed her speech over and over, but deep down, she knew it wasn't the speech that would matter. It was the actions that followed. It was about delivering on the promises she had made. Clara stared at the folder in her hands, the documents inside telling a story she wasn't sure she was prepared to confront. The investigation had taken a dark turn. The negligence in the supply chain wasn't just an unfortunate mistake. It looked like it was intentional. Someone, somewhere, had been cutting corners to save costs, and now the consequences were far-reaching. If this information came to light, it would completely obliterate the hospital's reputation and could even put them at risk of losing their medical license. The phone buzzed on her desk, snapping her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was Michelle. "Clara, we need to talk." Michelle's voice crackled through the speaker when Clara answered. "I've just seen the report," Clara said, not bothering with pleasantries. "This is bad. Really bad." "I know," Michelle replied, her tone low. "I've been going through everything, and it's worse than we thought. I've also spoken to some of the legal team. We're looking at potential criminal charges if we can't prove it wasn't intentional." Clara's heart sank. The idea that someone at St. Luke's had purposely compromised patient safety in order to save a buck made her feel physically ill. She had always believed in the mission of the hospital, helping those in need, no matter their background. The thought that someone might betray that mission for personal gain was unimaginable. "What's the next step?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling in her mind. "We need to act fast," Michelle said. "First, we have to get ahead of the story. The press will catch wind of this soon, and if we're not prepared, we're done. I'll arrange a crisis management meeting with the team, and we need to start preparing our statement." Clara rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her. She had to protect the hospital, its staff, and the community it served. But more than anything, she had to make sure that those responsible for this would be held accountable. She couldn't let this slide. Too many lives had been affected. Set up the meeting, Clara said firmly. I'll be there in an hour. I need to review the details with legal first. An hour later, Clara entered the conference room, her mind spinning. The team was already there. Michelle, the head of legal, the PR team, and a few other key players. As Clara took her seat, she could sense the tension in the air. The calm before the storm, she thought. Clara, we've gathered all the information we can, Michelle said, passing her a report. There's a clear trail of negligence. But it's not just negligence. There's a conspiracy here. Clara's eyes widened as she scanned the pages in front of her. Names, dates, transactions. It all pointed to a series of cutbacks in the medication supply process, all the way from the top down. Someone had made sure that the cheaper, lower-quality medication had been sent out, knowingly putting patients at risk. This is criminal, Clara said softly, more to herself than anyone else in the room. How could someone do this? It's not just about profit, the legal head, Mark, added grimly. It's about power. Whoever orchestrated this had a lot to gain from the savings, and we're talking millions of dollars. Clara clenched her jaw. She had always prided herself on St. Luke's being a place of integrity. She had been proud of its history of providing excellent care, even when resources were tight. But now she realized that some people had exploited those very same vulnerabilities. And now the truth had to come out. We need to find out who's behind this, Clara said, her voice determined. And we need to do it before this story breaks wide. We're already working on it, Michelle said. But there's a risk. If we go after the wrong people, or if we don't have enough evidence, the media will destroy us. They'll paint us all as complicit. I don't care what the media says, Clara said, her tone hardening. This isn't about saving face anymore. This is about doing what's right. We expose the truth, no matter what it costs us. As the meeting continued, Clara found herself immersed in the strategy session. They discussed everything from internal investigations to securing legal protections for whistleblowers within the hospital. The PR team was already preparing a statement that would address the issue head-on, but Clara knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. They needed real, actionable steps, transparency, accountability, and above all, justice. Later that evening, Clara sat at her desk, reviewing the documents one last time. She hadn't expected this situation to escalate so quickly, but she also knew that this was the test of her career. She had always worked in healthcare because she believed in making a difference. Now, she had to ensure that the people who had betrayed that belief would be held accountable. The door to her office creaked open. She looked up to see Michelle standing in the doorway, holding a phone. Clara, you're going to want to hear this, Michelle said, her voice tight with urgency. Clara stood up, walking over to Michelle. What is it? It's Elon, Michelle said, handing Clara the phone. He's calling in to check on things. Clara's heart raced. She knew Elon had promised to help, but she hadn't expected him to stay this involved. Hello? Clara said, trying to steady her voice. Elon here, came the calm response. How's it going? Clara briefly summarized the situation, the investigation, and the potential fallout. She didn't sugarcoat it. Elon needed to understand the gravity of the situation. I thought as much, Elon said thoughtfully. We've been monitoring the news, and I've made some calls. There's something I want to do to help you, but it's going to require more than just money. You need leverage. You need the right people on your side. Clara listened intently. What do you mean by leverage? I'm putting together a team, an elite group of investigators, legal experts, and media specialists. These are people I trust. They can help you get to the bottom of this, and we'll make sure it doesn't get buried. Trust me, we can turn this around. Clara let out a slow breath. This was what she had been waiting for. Real support, the kind that could make a difference. Thank you, Clara said, her voice filled with gratitude. We need all the help we can get. You're not alone in this, Elon replied. We'll fix this. Together. As she hung up, Clara felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in days, she wasn't sure of everything, but she knew one thing. She was going to fight for St. Luke's, no matter what it took. The storm was far from over, but Clara now had the tools, and the allies, to face it head-on. As she prepared for the next battle, she couldn't help but wonder who else was pulling strings behind the scenes. Was there someone even more powerful than she had realized? And could they stop this before it was too late? Clara sat in her office, staring at the report before her. The papers were scattered across her desk, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. Despite the relief she had felt when Elon promised to help, she knew the fight was just beginning. As the night wore on, the more she read, the more disturbing it became. It wasn't just about the medication cuts anymore. It was much larger than that. This web of deceit was tangled with powerful forces, and the truth seemed to be just beyond her grasp. Her mind raced with questions. Who had started the chain of corruption? Was this a small-scale operation, or something far more insidious? Clara had always believed that the good in people would ultimately prevail, but now she wasn't so sure. There were players involved in this mess who had enough power to bury the truth, and no amount of good intentions would bring it to light if they didn't move quickly. The phone on her desk buzzed again. It was Michelle. "Clara, you need to see this." Michelle's voice sounded unusually grim. Clara's pulse quickened. "What's going on?" "I've been digging deeper into the financial records. Someone's been siphoning off funds, moving them through various shell companies. And there's more. There are payments linked to some very familiar names." Clara leaned forward, bracing herself. "Who?" Michelle's voice lowered even further. "Elon's right-hand man, John Whitaker, and a few others connected to the board. It's not just negligence, it's outright fraud." Clara's blood ran cold. John Whitaker. She knew him as one of Elon's most trusted advisors. He had been in the background, making all the right decisions, and he had always been supportive of the hospital's cause. To hear that his name was tied to something so horrific was almost too much to process. "Are you sure about this?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've double-checked everything. The money trails, the accounts, there's no doubt," Michelle confirmed. "Clara, this goes all the way to the top." Clara leaned back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. The world she had worked so hard to build, the values she had instilled in the hospital, were crumbling before her eyes. How could someone so close to Elon Musk, a man she admired, be involved in something so damaging? "Let's not jump to conclusions just yet," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need more evidence, and we need to be careful. If we accuse the wrong person, this could backfire." "I agree," Michelle replied, "but we need to act fast. The more time we waste, the deeper this goes." Clara took a deep breath. She had no choice now but to move forward, even if it meant uncovering things she wasn't prepared to face. "I'll meet you at the hospital in 30 minutes. We'll go over everything and plan our next steps." When Clara arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere was tense. Nurses and doctors went about their work, but there was an undercurrent of anxiety that hung in the air. Clara met with Michelle and the legal team in one of the smaller conference rooms. As she walked in, she noticed that the mood had shifted even further. "We've received some troubling news," Mark, the head of legal, said, his voice low. "It seems like someone within the hospital has caught wind of our investigation. The rumors are already spreading." Clara frowned. "How?" "Leaks. We're still trying to pinpoint who is behind them," Mark replied. "But it's getting harder to keep this under wraps." Clara clenched her fists. "We can't let this get out before we have all the facts. If this hits the press without us being prepared, we're done." "Which is why we need to move quickly," Michelle interjected. "I've been in touch with Elon's team, and they're ready to back us up. But we need to make sure we have everything in order before the media catches wind of this." Clara nodded, her mind racing. They had to stay ahead of the story. If they were going to take down those responsible, they needed more than just circumstantial evidence. They needed a smoking gun. "Do we have access to the internal systems?" Clara asked, turning to Mark. "I want to review the transactions, the emails, and anything that links John Whitaker to these shell companies. We need to trace every penny." Mark nodded. "I'll get the IT department on it. We'll dig deeper into their communications and financial records." Clara's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. The head nurse, Rachel, stepped into the room, looking frazzled. "Clara, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to see. One of the patients in the ICU is asking for you. He insists it's urgent," Rachel said, her face pale. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had seen dozens of patients come through the ICU, but something about Rachel's tone made this one seem different. "I'll be right there," Clara said, standing up quickly. As they made their way to the ICU, Clara's mind raced. Who could it be? What was so urgent? They entered the dimly lit ICU, and Clara was immediately struck by the sight of a man sitting up in bed, despite the numerous medical devices attached to him. His face was gaunt, and there was an air of familiarity to him that Clara couldn't quite place. As she walked closer, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "Elon," Clara whispered, her heart nearly stopping. Elon Musk, despite his frail appearance, managed a small smile. "I knew I'd find you here." Clara was stunned. What are you doing here?" "I had to see you, Clara," Elon said, his voice hoarse. "I know you've been doing everything you can to protect the hospital, but there's something you need to know. Someone has been feeding information to the press. And it's not just about the medication." Clara's stomach turned. "What do you mean?" "There's a lot more at stake than you realize," Elon said, his eyes narrowing. "You're dealing with forces you can't even begin to comprehend. The deeper you dig, the more dangerous it becomes. Trust no one." Clara stood frozen, her mind reeling. She had known this investigation would lead her into dangerous territory, but she hadn't expected to hear words like this from Elon himself. The stakes were higher than she had imagined, and it was clear that someone was watching her every move. But who? And how far would they go to silence the truth? Clara's mind raced as she processed Elon Musk's words. Trust no one. The phrase echoed in her ears like a warning from a distant storm. Her body tensed, and for a moment, the ICU room seemed to close in around her. She had been investigating the corruption within the hospital, but now she realized this was no longer just about the hospital. It was something far larger, something more dangerous. Elon shifted in his bed, his pale face pinched with exhaustion. "The people behind this are ruthless, Clara," he continued, his voice strained but resolute. "They won't stop until they've buried everything and everyone standing in their way." Clara's throat tightened as she tried to steady herself. She had never imagined that a simple desire to help people in need could lead to a conspiracy that stretched so far. The last thing she wanted was to become a pawn in someone's twisted game. But with the stakes as high as they were, there was no turning back now. "Who can I trust, then?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elon's eyes softened, a faint glimmer of regret in them. "I wish I could tell you," he replied, "but the truth is, you're already deeper into this than anyone realizes. You have to be careful." Clara nodded slowly, her thoughts a whirlwind. She felt a deep sense of responsibility to her patients, to the people who had placed their trust in her hands. But now she was also carrying the weight of a conspiracy much darker than she ever imagined. Later that evening, Clara sat alone in her office, staring at the wall in front of her. The sounds of the hospital, distant beeping, the soft murmur of voices, faded into the background as her mind worked to piece everything together. She couldn't shake the image of Elon in the ICU, looking so fragile, yet somehow still a beacon of hope. If he was right, she was walking into the lion's den, and every step she took could lead her further down a path she wouldn't be able to return from. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. She looked up to see Michelle standing in the doorway, her expression grim. "Clara, we need to talk." Clara nodded, gesturing for Michelle to come in. "What's going on?" Michelle stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "We've been able to trace the financial records back further. It's worse than we thought." She pulled out a folder from her bag and set it down on Clara's desk. "The payments don't just stop at John Whitaker. There's a whole network of companies involved, and they go beyond the hospital. Some of these connections lead to people in very high places." Clara frowned. "Who are we talking about here?" Michelle's voice dropped to a whisper. "Government officials, politicians, even people from outside the country. The longer we look into this, the more dangerous it gets." Clara's stomach churned. She felt a cold sweat bead on her forehead. "How deep does this go?" "Deep enough that the people behind this have resources that could erase all traces of this operation in a heartbeat," Michelle replied. "We need to be careful. One wrong move, and we could be left with nothing." Clara stood up, pacing the room as she tried to make sense of everything. This was no longer about saving the hospital. It was about survival. She had to find the right moment to strike, to expose the corruption without falling victim to it herself. But with so many powerful people involved, how could she even begin to outsmart them? "We can't go public with this yet," Clara said, her voice determined. "We need more proof, more leverage. If we expose this too soon, they'll crush us." Michelle nodded. "I agree. But the clock is ticking, Clara. The longer we wait, the more evidence disappears, and the more dangerous it becomes." Clara paused, her mind turning. "Then we need to gather everything. All the financials, the communications, any piece of evidence that ties them all together. And we need to go after John Whitaker first. If we can take him down, we might have a chance." Michelle looked uncertain. "Are you sure about this? He's close to Elon, and if we accuse him, it could destroy everything. People will question Elon's judgment, and that could put us all in jeopardy." Clara took a deep breath, her resolve strengthening. "I don't have a choice. I can't stand by while innocent lives are destroyed for the sake of greed. We have to expose this, no matter the cost." The next few days were a blur of frantic research, late-night meetings, and covert efforts to gather more information. Clara worked tirelessly with Michelle and the legal team, poring over every piece of data they could find. The web of deceit that had been spun around them was vast, and the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. There were encrypted files, hidden bank accounts, and shadowy figures involved in every transaction. It felt as though every step forward led to 2 more steps into the darkness. One afternoon, Clara received an unexpected call. It was from Elon. "I've been thinking about what you said." Elon's voice was serious, his tone no longer carrying the same frail exhaustion it had the last time they spoke. "You're right. The hospital is at the center of something much bigger than I imagined. And I've decided to take action." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I've set up a meeting with some people who can help," Elon said. "But you need to be careful. You don't know who you can trust right now. Make sure your next move is the right one." Clara felt a surge of hope, but also a nagging sense of uncertainty. "When is this meeting?" "In 2 days," Elon replied. "I'll have my team reach out to you with the details. Be ready." As Clara prepared for the meeting, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking on a razor's edge. Every step she took seemed to lead her closer to a confrontation with the very people who had orchestrated the corruption. But now, more than ever, she knew that she couldn't turn back. The hospital, her patients, and the very values she stood for were on the line. Clara stared at the phone in her hand, the weight of Elon's words settling in her chest. This meeting could be the key to exposing everything, but it could also be a trap. Who could she trust, and how far would the conspiracy go to protect itself? The next move could change everything. The next 2 days felt like a blur for Clara. Time seemed to stretch and compress at odd intervals, as if the world was holding its breath in anticipation. She knew the meeting with Elon's contacts could be the turning point in the battle against the conspiracy, but she also knew it was fraught with risks. Every moment felt like it was teetering on the edge of disaster. Clara spent the hours before the meeting preparing herself mentally, reviewing all the files, notes, and leads they had uncovered. Michelle had managed to gather more information about the hidden financial transactions, while Clara spent her time digging into the backgrounds of the people involved. There were powerful names attached to this conspiracy, people with connections that reached into every corner of society. It was becoming clearer by the day that the hospital wasn't just a tool in their scheme. It was a key part of something much larger, something global in scale. As Clara read through the information again, her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at the screen. It was a text from Elon. "The meeting location has been secured. Stay sharp. Trust no one. Don't bring anyone with you." Clara's pulse quickened as she typed a quick reply. "I understand. I'll be there." The instructions were simple. Meet in an upscale hotel in downtown. The address was marked on the map she'd received through a secure channel. It was a high-end venue, a place where the wealthy and powerful went to escape the public eye. Clara knew that it wasn't just the location that would be dangerous. It was the people in the room. On the day of the meeting, Clara dressed carefully, nothing too eye-catching. but enough to blend in with the high-profile crowd that often frequented such places. She couldn't afford to draw attention to herself. The last thing she needed was to have someone figure out that she was the one trying to unravel their world of secrets. As she entered the hotel lobby, her eyes scanned the room. It was elegant, but there was an air of exclusivity that made Clara feel like an outsider. Her heart raced as she approached the designated meeting room, a private suite tucked away at the end of a long hallway. She couldn't help but feel that she was walking deeper into the lion's den, each step echoing in her mind like a countdown. When she reached the door, she hesitated. Her hand lingered on the handle for a moment before she took a deep breath and pushed it open. The room was dimly lit, but Clara could make out 3 figures seated at a large, polished table. Elon Musk sat at the head of the table, looking more composed than he had in days. To his right sat a tall man with sharp features and an air of authority. Clara didn't recognize him, but she could sense he was someone important. On Elon's left was a woman with intense eyes and a businesslike demeanor. She was calm, but her presence was commanding. "Clara," Elon said, rising to greet her. His voice was steady, but Clara could detect a hint of caution behind his words. "Glad you could make it." "Of course," Clara replied, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. She could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her, but she steeled herself. She had come too far to back out now. Elon gestured to the chairs around the table. "Please, have a seat. We need to discuss the next steps carefully." Clara took a seat at the table, her eyes quickly flicking over each of the faces in the room. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not even for a second. The tall man with sharp features leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on Clara. "I'm Marcus Carter," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I'm here to help you navigate what comes next. You've been involved in something very dangerous, and the people you're up against are not going to let you go easily." Clara nodded, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I'm aware of the risks," she said quietly, "but I need to know who's behind this, and I need to know what we're really up against." The woman to Elon's left, who Clara had yet to address, spoke up. "You're right to be cautious, Clara," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "We've done a lot of digging, and what we've found is unsettling. The conspiracy you've uncovered is just the tip of the iceberg. The people involved have the power to influence not only the healthcare system but the global economy. This goes far beyond what you've been able to see so far." Clara's mind raced. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by someone who knew more about the situation than she did was a stark reminder of just how dangerous this had become. She had known they were up against powerful forces, but hearing it put so bluntly made the truth hit harder. Elon leaned in, his face serious. "What you're about to learn, Clara, could change everything. But first, you need to understand that this isn't just about the hospital anymore. It's about the people who are pulling the strings from behind the scenes. They don't just control businesses. They control governments, security forces, and organizations that could make or break entire industries." Clara felt a chill run through her. She'd suspected that there were powerful people at the top of the pyramid, but the scale of it was overwhelming. She was no longer just a nurse trying to protect her patients. She was a part of something that could bring down the very structure of power. Marcus spoke again, his voice steady. "We need to take down their entire network. We need to hit them where it hurts, expose them for who they really are. But we can't do it alone. We need you, Clara." Clara met his gaze, her heart pounding. "How can I help? I've already given you everything I know." "Your insight into the hospital's operations is invaluable," Marcus replied. "But what we need now is something more. We need to find the key players behind these operations, and we need to make sure that we have the evidence that will bring them down for good." Clara took a deep breath. This was it, the moment where she would either rise to the occasion or falter under the weight of the truth. She knew what she had to do. "Then let's finish this," she said, her voice filled with determination. The room fell silent for a moment as Clara's words hung in the air. The weight of what they were about to undertake settled over them all. They were no longer just fighting to expose the truth. They were preparing for war. But Clara knew that every victory came with a price. The real battle was just beginning. The night was heavy with tension as Clara left the meeting, her mind racing with the new information. She had never anticipated that the fight against the conspiracy would evolve into something this massive, but now that she had stepped into the deeper end of this dangerous game, there was no turning back. She was committed, both out of necessity and because, somewhere inside, she knew that the stakes were much higher than just exposing the corruption in the hospital. The sun had set as Clara made her way back to her apartment. The bustling streets of the city felt distant, a blur of lights and noise as her thoughts swirled. Every decision from here on out would have massive consequences. The lives of those she cared about were at risk. She arrived home, locking the door behind her. But before she could sit down and process everything, her phone buzzed again. The message was from Michelle, her trusted ally in this investigation. Meeting tomorrow, same place. Be ready. We're finalizing plans. They'll know we're coming for them. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she read the message. She knew what was coming. This would be the moment when they would have to make a bold move, expose the conspiracy, or risk losing everything. The next morning, Clara made her way to the designated safe house. It wasn't the first time she'd been there, but this time felt different. The walls seemed to close in a little tighter. Marcus, Elon, and Michelle were already waiting when Clara arrived. "Clara," Marcus greeted her, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk about the next phase. The operation will begin tomorrow." She nodded, knowing what this meant. She had prepared herself for this moment, but nothing could prepare her for the risks that were about to unfold. "We've gathered everything we need," Elon added, his voice steady. "The evidence is airtight. But we need to go public, and that's going to be the most dangerous part. These people have eyes everywhere, and if they know we're coming, they'll try to shut us down." Clara swallowed hard. "And what do we do if they do?" "We fight back," Marcus said. "We make sure the truth gets out, no matter the cost. We'll be working with some of the most powerful people on our side, people who are willing to risk everything to bring this down." Clara couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to be that powerful, to have resources at your disposal that could change the course of history. But she knew that this wasn't just about power. This was about justice. The day of the operation arrived, and Clara's nerves were on edge. She had been briefed on every step, but nothing could fully prepare her for the chaos that would unfold. The plan was simple. They would use the evidence to leak information to the press, to launch a full-scale investigation into the conspiracy that had poisoned the hospital and beyond. But there was a major risk. The people they were going after were well-connected, and they weren't going to sit idly by while Clara and her team tried to bring them down. The group met in a secure location, surrounded by technology, and for the first time since she had started this journey, Clara felt like she was truly part of something bigger than herself. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a key player in an operation that could change the world. "We need to hit them fast and hard," Elon said, as the team gathered around the large table in the control room. "We'll launch a coordinated attack. Everything goes live at once. If they suspect anything, we'll lose our shot." Clara stood by, listening carefully, taking everything in. She had never imagined herself in the middle of something like this. The information they had gathered would be enough to bring down powerful people, people who thought they were untouchable. Michelle was already working at the computer terminal, setting up the necessary feeds and communication lines. She looked up at Clara, her expression serious. "Once we make the first move, it's going to get dangerous. We can't afford to hesitate." Clara felt her heart race as she thought about the risks. There was no guarantee they'd be successful. The people they were targeting had connections in high places. If they weren't careful, they could end up in far more danger than they ever anticipated. The operation began with a quiet, controlled release of information. News outlets received the first hints of a scandal, reports of a secretive medical conspiracy spreading like wildfire. Clara's stomach churned as she watched the events unfold, knowing that she and her team were the ones igniting the firestorm. Everything had to be timed perfectly. They had planted the evidence in key hands, made sure the leaks were legitimate, and now it was out in the open. The world would see what had been happening behind the scenes in the healthcare system, and the people involved would have nowhere to hide. The phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "We've got movement. Stay alert." Clara's eyes darted to the monitors, where news outlets were picking up the story. The first wave of journalists had begun to investigate, but something felt off. There was an underlying tension in the air. an uncertainty that Clara couldn't shake. A new message popped up on her phone. They know. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked at the message. It wasn't just a simple notification, it was a warning. The people behind this conspiracy were aware of the breach. They wouldn't just let it go. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, and a distant hum filled the air. Clara's instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. They had made their move, but now it was time to brace for the fallout. The game had changed again, and the battle for survival was just about to get more dangerous. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the room filled with an almost eerie silence. She watched the monitors flicker again, and then the security camera's feed went black. A chill ran down her spine as the realization hit her. Someone was already one step ahead. Her hand instinctively reached for her phone, but the message on the screen was gone. It was just a blur now, too quick to trace, but the warning was clear. They know. Michelle, Clara called, her voice urgent. What happened to the feed? Did you see that? Michelle didn't reply immediately. Her fingers were flying over the keyboard, eyes scanning the lines of code. After a tense pause, Michelle's face shifted. I think we've been hacked. They're already scrambling our communications. Clara stood motionless, her mind racing. She'd been so focused on the leaks and the carefully planned attack, she hadn't anticipated this level of retaliation. The conspiracy they were exposing was far deeper and more dangerous than they had imagined. Do we have a backup plan? Clara asked, her voice steadier than she felt. She knew that there was no room for hesitation now. If they couldn't get this right, everything they had worked for would unravel. There's no time, Elon responded sharply. They've already infiltrated our systems. We need to move fast and force their hand. If we delay, they'll erase everything. Clara's thoughts swirled. She had trusted this operation. It had been her only way to right the wrongs she had witnessed. And now, in an instant, it was all slipping through her fingers. If they couldn't expose the conspiracy now, it could be buried forever, along with the lives it had ruined. Marcus, Clara said, turning to the man who had been her constant ally throughout this journey. What do we do? Marcus exhaled slowly, his expression tense. We push through. We don't give them the chance to silence us. We go straight to the media. It's risky, but it's the only chance we have left. Clara nodded, her mind quickly processing his words. The plan was to bypass their current channels and go directly to the media outlets, a bold move that would ensure the story couldn't be retracted. But there was a massive risk. If they were too slow, or if they were intercepted, they would have no way of protecting themselves. Without waiting for further discussion, Michelle turned back to the screens, her fingers tapping furiously. I'm sending the final files to the press now. We can't stop it. Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach as the first wave of articles began to hit the internet. News outlets were running with the story, confirming the conspiracy that had been hidden for so long. Names of doctors, administrators, and corrupt officials flashed across the screen in shocking revelations. But just as quickly as the articles appeared, the room erupted in chaos. Damn it! Elon cursed, his voice sharp with urgency. They've locked down the media. The articles are disappearing. Clara's mind raced. They had been prepared for some level of resistance, but this was beyond anything they had anticipated. They had no way of knowing just how far the reach of this conspiracy went. Whoever was pulling the strings had vast resources at their disposal, and they were using every bit of it to cover their tracks. Stay calm, Marcus said, his voice steady even in the face of disaster. We can't let them get to us. If the articles are disappearing, we'll just have to find another way. We push the message through, one way or another. But as he spoke, Clara's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end would be one she would never forget. Clara, I hope you're ready, the voice said, a menacing tone in it. You've made your move, but now we're going to make ours. It was a voice Clara didn't recognize, but it didn't take long for her to put the pieces together. The person on the other end was someone deeply involved in the conspiracy. They had been tracking her from the start. The game had just shifted into a much more dangerous phase. Who is this? Clara demanded, trying to keep her voice calm. Oh, I think you know, the voice replied with a twisted chuckle. You've made a lot of enemies, Clara. And there's only so much you can hide from the truth. Clara's stomach dropped. The threats had begun. The question wasn't if they were going to come for her, it was when. And she knew she had no choice but to keep going. There was no turning back now. As she ended the call, she turned back to her team. We need to make the information public. Right now. But as they scrambled to find another route to get the truth out, the hospital's security forces arrived at the building, cutting off their exits. Looks like we've got company, Michelle said grimly, looking out the window at the convoy of SUVs that had pulled up. Clara's heart raced. It was time to take action. The operation they had planned was quickly spiraling into a life-or-death situation, and they were about to find out how far the conspiracy would go to protect itself. The sound of boots pounding the pavement grew louder as Clara and the team scrambled to secure the final data. The walls of the small, hidden control room were closing in. They had started a war, but now they were trapped in the crossfire. How far would they go to expose the truth? The air in the small, dimly lit room felt thick with tension as Clara paced, her mind racing. The countdown was on, and she could hear the distant sound of boots echoing down the hallway, growing closer with each passing second. They had minutes, maybe less, before the security forces stormed the room and shut everything down for good. Elon, Michelle, and Marcus were huddled around the computers, scrambling to send the data out to every media outlet they could access. But with each failed attempt, the frustration grew. The encrypted files had already been compromised, and the messages were being intercepted in real time. The conspiracy was smarter than they had expected. "This is it, Clara," Michelle said, her voice strained. "They're closing in on us. If we don't get this out now, it's over." Clara stood at the window, watching as the convoy outside expanded. The black SUVs were now surrounded by armed guards, securing the perimeter. They were ready to take everything from them, but they couldn't afford to let that happen. Her heart pounded. She'd never imagined things would escalate to this level. But then again, she hadn't expected to expose an operation that reached into the highest levels of power and influence. Now, as she looked at the desperate faces of her team, she knew there was no choice but to push forward. If they didn't act now, the truth would be buried forever, and all of their sacrifices would be in vain. "Do we have an escape route?" Clara asked Marcus, her voice firm, despite the nerves gnawing at her insides. Marcus shook his head. "The front and back exits are blocked. The only way out is through the tunnels beneath the hospital. But we'll have to move fast. If they catch us down there, it's over." Clara turned back to the monitors. Time was running out, but there was one final option they hadn't tried. An untraceable satellite uplink that Elon had set up months ago. It was the last, desperate move they had left. If they could get the data to the satellites, they could broadcast the evidence worldwide, bypassing the security forces and any attempt to suppress the story. But it would be risky. Elon was the only one who knew how to initiate the upload, and he had no idea if the encryption could hold up under such pressure. It could fail at any moment. "Let's do it," Clara said, her voice resolute. "Elon, you know what to do. We don't have time to waste." Elon nodded, his face a mask of determination. He quickly typed in a series of commands, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. The room grew quieter as everyone held their breath, watching the screen for any sign of movement. The countdown on the satellite uplink began. A small green light flickered on the corner of the monitor, signaling that the transfer was in progress. The data was being sent, and as long as the encryption held, the truth would be broadcasted across the globe. Clara dared not hope, but she couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. But just as quickly as that hope blossomed, the door to the room was violently shoved open. A group of armed guards flooded in, their guns trained on Clara and the others. "Freeze!" one of the guards shouted. "Hands up, now!" Clara's pulse raced as she instinctively raised her hands. She exchanged a quick glance with Elon, Michelle, and Marcus. The satellite uplink was still in progress, but how long would it take before the transmission was interrupted? "Don't shoot," Clara said, her voice steady but laced with tension. "You don't want to do this." The lead guard scoffed, stepping closer to Clara. "This is bigger than you, lady. You've already made your move. It's too late now." Clara's mind raced. There had to be something they could do, something to stall long enough for the data to reach its destination. Then, a thought struck her, a dangerous thought, but one that might buy them the time they needed. If you shoot, Clara said, her eyes narrowing, you'll be exposing your own people. There's a lot riding on what we're doing here. You don't want to make that mistake. The guard hesitated, clearly unsure of what she meant. But Clara didn't wait for him to decide. She knew that the moment they realized she wasn't bluffing, they would do whatever it took to stop her. She took a step forward, her voice rising. The entire world will see what you're doing here. The files we've sent out, what we've exposed, it's not just about me anymore. It's about everything. The truth is out there. And no matter what you do to us, you can't take that back. The lead guard's face twisted with rage, but his hesitation was enough. The moment stretched on, a tense standoff. And in that moment, Clara felt a small victory. They were stalling. Then, a sudden click from the monitor snapped her back to reality. It's done, Elon said, his voice tinged with relief. The upload is complete. It's out there. The tension in the room shifted. The guard's eyes widened in disbelief as he glanced at the screen. But Clara knew it wasn't over yet. The fight was just beginning. The guards looked at each other nervously, clearly realizing that the consequences of their actions were much larger than they had anticipated. Clara stepped forward, standing tall despite the danger surrounding them. You can still walk away from this, she said, her voice unwavering. You don't have to be part of this any longer. But if you're going to stop us, you're going to have to kill us. And that's a decision you'll have to live with for the rest of your life. The guards hesitated, the tension crackling in the air. The truth was out. But would they stop the oncoming storm, or would they try to erase it all? Clara knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The silence in the room was deafening. The armed guards stood frozen, eyes flicking between Clara, Elon, and the computer screen, which now displayed a bold message, data transmission complete. The enormity of the situation seemed to weigh on everyone in the room. Clara's pulse was racing, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She knew the data was out there, but there was no telling how far it would reach, or how long it would take before the conspiracy tried to contain the damage. They were in the midst of a war now, one that had just begun. There would be no going back. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara felt a spark of hope. The truth had been delivered, and no matter how much they tried to bury it, it was out of their hands. The world would see what had been hidden for so long. The lead guard stepped back, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered his weapon. Clara noticed the fear in his eyes. Whatever decisions they made in the next few moments would define their futures. His colleagues were similarly uncertain, their postures less rigid, more hesitant. The message they had just intercepted, the one they'd been ordered to prevent, was now live, and they knew they couldn't undo it. Clara held her ground. You know what's at stake here. You don't have to keep following orders from people who don't care about you. This isn't about protecting them anymore. It's about doing what's right. The lead guard looked at his companions, a silent conversation passing between them. They were faced with a choice: follow through with their mission, or walk away from the life they'd been forced into. The tension was unbearable, but Clara kept her eyes on them, unwavering. Without another word, the guards slowly started to lower their weapons. One by one, they stepped back from the group, exchanging glances as if silently agreeing to let Clara and her team go. Clara exhaled, the weight lifting slightly from her shoulders. But the victory was bittersweet. They hadn't won the war yet, but they had bought themselves the chance to keep fighting. The data they had sent out was already causing ripples across the world, and there was no telling what would happen next. But one thing was certain: they couldn't stop now. As the guards backed out of the room, Clara turned to Elon and Michelle, who were still seated at the computers, eyes glued to the screen. The data was live, but they hadn't yet seen the full impact. What would the world do with the information they had just exposed? Would anyone believe it? Would the powerful people behind this conspiracy try to erase it before the truth could take root? What now? Marcus asked, breaking the silence. His voice was tinged with exhaustion, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. We've done our part. Now it's up to everyone else. Clara nodded slowly. Now we wait. The world will see what's been hidden from them. And when the truth hits, they'll have to act. Elon looked up from the screen, his expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. It's out there, Clara. We've done everything we can. But we're not out of the woods yet. There's still a lot of cleanup to be done, and the people behind this, whoever they are, won't stop. Clara turned to the rest of the team. We can't stop either. We've taken the first step, but we need to keep pushing. We need to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. The room fell into a heavy silence, but Clara's words had reignited the fire within them. They were in this together, and as long as they kept fighting, they would have a chance to make a real difference. Outside, the city was starting to wake up. The media would be flooded with the truth soon enough, and the world would change forever. But as Clara looked out at the horizon, she knew that this was only the beginning. They weren't just exposing a conspiracy, they were igniting a movement. And the forces that had tried to hide the truth would soon learn that they had underestimated the power of a small group of people willing to fight for what was right. As the sun rose on a new day, Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. It wasn't over yet, but it was a victory nonetheless. The truth was out, and the world would never be the same. But in the back of her mind, Clara knew that the battle was just beginning. The fight for justice would continue, and the road ahead would be long and difficult. Yet she was no longer afraid, for she knew that with each truth that came to light, they were one step closer to winning the war. And this time, no one would be able to stop them. This concludes the story of Clara and her team's journey to expose the truth. Thank you for following their journey from the hospital to the high-stakes battle for justice. What they did was just the first step, and the real work begins after this.